Hey, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is November 9th, 2024. The time is about 10:57 a.m. where I'm at right now. And this is part 2 of the Book to React series number 7, where we are reading Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson III. This book you can get on Amazon for the humble price of only $19.95 hardcover, paperback only $11.66. Published in 2020, and it's a book about a philosophical framework or worldview that looks at Blackness pessimistically, or the future of Blackness pessimistically. And I find this book fascinating. It's been on my reading list for a long time, and been looking forward to reading it, and I feel like no better time to read it is now. And the current circumstances of our world motivate me to read this right now. So we finished chapter 1 in our last reading, which we did yesterday. You can go check that out on the channel. And today we will be reading chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is titled Juice from a Neck Bone. In the previous chapter, he was talking about his experience of having a stroke or like a heart attack, and waking up in the ambulance and having two white paramedics over him, and their faces turning from care and concern to fear when he finally came to. And he also talked about his experiences working as a stockbroker, then eventually quitting that job after making a lot of money working there for almost a decade, then ends up working as a security guard at a museum, meeting a Palestinian friend. Both of them bond over their shared trauma of their people, but he is then taken aback when his Palestinian friend expresses explicit anti-Blackness, and that begins the motors in his mind of talking about or understanding that Blackness is seen as the antithesis to humanity, because even when people are oppressed by other people who are non-Black, they end up still viewing Blackness as the ultimate enemy to them, the antithesis of what humanity is to them. And he expounds on it more in deeper fashion in chapter 1, and he lays out the groundwork for how to understand Afro-pessimism as a meta theory, or aporia, as he said. And very interesting chapter. We're going to continue in chapter 2, Juice from a Neck Bone. We'll read until the end of chapter 3, and then I'll catch y'all later. So let's go. Chapter 2. So, at the age of 11, I lay at night alone in the dark on the floor of our living room, listening to Gregorian chants, phonograph recordings of my mother's cantorum, the choir of which she was a member at the Basilica of St. Mary in downtown Minneapolis. Pardon, let me close that. Alone in the dark, I saw myself 10 years in the future, draped in a white cassock, followed down the cold stone aisle by 2 altar boys. Traced with incense was the cool cathedral air. It was humid in Minnesota that summer of 1967. The summer of love on the California coast was a moist, mosquito-harassed season in the land of 10,000 lakes. But it was cool on the floor, so I would lie shirtless on the carpet and surrender my skin to the sonorous sounds. Wake upon wake of mounting waves through which I tunneled and imagined myself as a priest. Sanctuary. I was no Afro-pessimist at the age of 11, and my knowledge of what gave me so much anxiety was bereft of a critical race vocabulary. But I knew I was Black, not because smells of filet powder and smoked sausage thickening in a gumbo room wafted from my house and no other in the neighborhood, but because we were the only ones they called Negroes. I would not be Black until the following year, 1968, when I turned 12. In the dark at 11, lying on the living room floor, I knew I was a Negro, not due to my cultural elements, but because it was my source of shame, a shame not shared by the neighbors. The Gregorian chants trembled in my chest, extending the darkness in long, hollow catacombs that stretched through me and out the other side, where I saw myself in the future. A future where I was revered by my parishioners instead of shunned, as I was in my first grade by a little girl who wouldn't hold my hand for fear that my suit would stain her. In the sound tunnel of my future, the children and my teachers genuflected when I passed. They stood and knelt on my command. They confessed their sins to me before being worthy of the blood of Christ. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I wouldn't hold his hand because his suit would rub off on me. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I called him a monkey when he climbed up the rope in gym class. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Between my teeth and my upper lip, I wedged my tongue and scratched my armpits when he climbed down. Bless me, Father, for we have sinned. We laughed. Bless me, Father, for we have sinned. We pressed his face in the snow. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I called him friend and brought him home to my mother's curiosity. How does it feel, she asked, to be a Negro? Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I made him face the class and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Wow, talk about writing right there. Damn, uh, that's a powerful paragraph right there. Yeah, for me growing up, I definitely had those experiences of being like a very, very young kid and discovering my blackness by the pain that was inflicted upon me by the other kids in class, right? I remember very, very young, I think I was in like pre-K or kindergarten, one of those very, very early stages. And I remember like these little white kids that I used to play with before, one day just saying like, we don't want to play with you. And I was like, why? Like literally nothing changed from the previous day. And they just said, we just don't want to play with you. And they turned their backs for me and like ran away and stuff like that. And of course, growing up in Louisiana, right? All sorts of racism is around. You grew up seeing like Confederate flags and stuff like that. Before I even knew what they were, just the energy of it, of that place, sort of informed me and informed my environment. Continuing here. Let's continue. So my chest, my arms, and the Cabernet carpet soaked their confessions like a field of wheat, repeating the sound of rain. When my aunts and uncles came up from New Orleans or from the sweet, pungent soil 40 miles upriver, they'd ask me if I wanted the light turned on. Children down south didn't brood in the dark. No, Aunt Joyce, I want the dark. You relaxing, baby? Yes, I would answer. I'm relaxing. When what I really meant was, I'm composing my hymn of redemption. I was at rest, but I wasn't relaxing. Relaxation is a state of being in the present, living scenes of the present. As a boy, I seldom lived in the present. It hurt too much to be in the present. When I occurred to myself, I was myself in the future. The present was the penance, what I had to pay for my suit. I dreamed that the present would pass one day, but I arrived each year to find that the present had already packed its bags on the road to meet me. It was standing in the lobby with my room key. Even as I lay on the floor of our living room and took confessions from sinners of the present in their incarnation as supplicants of tomorrow, I knew in some deep place beneath the chance that the present would always be waiting for me. At the end of that summer, sixth grade would be no different than the slow acid drip of years gone by. Another year of seeing myself through the eyes of others. Our young Negro neighbor, the Wilderson boy, cleaner than you might expect, polite, well-spoken, fresh smelling, oh God, too quick to fight. Behind in spelling, ahead in spelling, reads above his grade level, late with his math homework, ashy legs, gorilla lips, been known to wet the bed. Jesus Christ. You know, growing up as that one black kid surrounded by white people, you really get to know white people that way. Like you really get to see the wickedness inherent in whiteness, not in white people, but in the world that is built around whiteness, because blackness is the other. It was the permanent other to whiteness. Not a healthy place for children to grow up, I would say. Continuing here. That Christmas passed, my teacher recommended that I repeat the fifth grade. In the fourth grade, they said I was so smart I could skip fifth grade. My parents, however, did not like the idea of kids skipping grades. Then in the fifth grade, I began to wet the bed more often and my mind shut down. I couldn't or wouldn't get up in the morning. Months passed without one assignment being turned in. That summer, as I listened to Gregorian chants, I marveled at how I made it out of fifth grade. In March, I had gone to my teacher and asked for all the assignments I hadn't turned in. She said, how about everything since October? Over Easter break, I closed the door to my room and completed 6 months worth of math and reading assignments in 1 week. I dumped them on her desk in April. She graded them all and gave me all A's and B's. It took her a week to grade them, and she scolded me for giving her such a fright all year. I took my praise by proxy. Had I been white, my athleticism and my charm would have made me popular. My friends would have been popular too, but my friends were from the land of misfit toys. Liam Gunderson couldn't distinguish between the threat of a bear and the threat of a butterfly. He hyperventilated and bit his arm when someone raised a hand to him. His father and mother came from Norway and had been tortured in a Japanese internment camp when they were missionaries in China. The children on the playground got their kicks whenever Liam bit his arms. He was the youngest of 13, who were grown and gone. His brothers had left behind novels by Graham Greene, John le Carre, and Ian Fleming. Liam and I spent long hours reading them in his attic. In the 3 years from 11 through 13, I spent in Liam's attic. I didn't understand those books as well as Liam did, nor could I translate the smattering of French words that Graham Greene dropped on the page like spare change. But Liam could. Oscar Nelson's dad was a chiropractor, which meant witch doctor in the rich white enclave of Kenwood, where parents were executives, bankers, architects, attorneys, doctors, and statesmen like Senator, soon to be Vice President Walter Mondale, interesting, and Mark Dayton, a politician whose family owned Target, and B. Dalton bookseller. Uh, then there was Elgar Davenport, who was short and stout and looked at the world through Coke bottle glasses and the left eye that wandered as if lost. Elgar was a quiet embarrassment to his mother, who was blonde, trim, and sporty, and always walked ahead of him. Elgar had red hair and freckles. Mr. Davenport drove a red Corvette and played the market for a job. I thought it would be cool if my father bought a sports car in my color, but then as quickly as it came into my mind, the downside followed. The downside of owning a sports car in my color was something I felt without having words for it, but knowledge is often deeper than words. Some similarities to how I grew up. I mean, growing up in the north side of Monroe, Louisiana, was surrounded by white people. Like, yeah, we were like the only we were the only black people in my neighborhood for like a few blocks, right? There's like black people here and there in like the Garden District, North Side, and stuff like that. But like literally, my street was just like old white people. And but when I went to my high school, like Neville High School, in fact, all through elementary school, middle school, and high school, it was like 50-50 black white. You get what I'm saying? So I had white friends at high school, but also black friends at high school. So I got like that mix of both worlds, if that could be certain things. But I always remembered I was black, and there was never like, how can I say this? Like I told that story earlier about being in pre-K or kindergarten and dealing with anti-Blackness then. And I dealt with anti-Blackness, here and there throughout coming up in elementary, middle school, high school, and stuff like that. But there was always that affirmation of Blackness around too, because we had so many like black kids in my schools and stuff like that. But grew up like suburban American lifestyle. Once you leave school, you just come home. And if you're in the suburbs, it's not like kids outside playing basketball or like parks you could go to. So we were just inside, me and my brother playing video games, sometimes riding our bikes in the neighborhood. I was a rapper back then, making music, coming home and stuff like that, doing writing, doing homework and stuff like that. It's like once I left school, I was just in this once black family world, right? Me and my brother just sort of bouncing ideas off each other and interacting with each other. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, very interesting. So Elgar Davenport, Liam Gunderson, Oscar Nelson, and I were playing secret agent on the grounds of a dark stone mansion across the street from my house. The house had an elevator and 10 bedrooms, I was told, though in the 16 years I lived across the street from it, I was never inside. It changed hands. At one point, a wealthy family with almost as many kids as bedrooms, though they were too young to be my playmates. At another time, Senator Mark Dayton. It was his family home away from Washington, and they would live there until he became governor and moved to the governor's mansion in St. Paul. We played secret agent on the far grounds away from the main building, near a one-bedroom carriage house at the end of the wide gravel drive. The mansion served its purpose. It was vital to the mise-en-scene of our spy games. Sometimes it was the Soviet embassy in a dark wooden corner of Washington, D.C. Sometimes it was a SMERSH center for the training of assassins who were being prepared to kill James Bond. Our spy games were more Salvador Dali than Ian Fleming. For example, a low wire fence ran along one end of the property, separating the backyard of a smaller mansion from the Dayton home. We called this wire fence the Berlin Wall, without making any geographical adjustments, such as relocating the mansion from Washington, D.C. to Berlin. The surrealists in us ruled over cartographic realists. If we didn't draw straws, we'd end up being four boys playing CIA agents and no communists. One sour day, Elgar and I drew Soviet spy draws. Liam and Oscar were the good guys. The game involved two witless Soviets running and screaming at two witless Americans who also ran and screamed as they tried to hurdle the low wire fence of the Berlin Wall and get back to Checkpoint Charlie before the Soviets caught them. Elgar and I crouched behind the carriage house at the end of the gravel drive. The Americans would come from somewhere up near the mansion, but we didn't know which side of the mansion. Normally, one of the boys who played the good guys would be the decoy, the one who would come out from a tree on the side of the mansion and run at breakneck speed toward a far end of the fence, while the other boy waited until both Soviets had been drawn away. Then he would try to make his escape. Elgar and I peered out from behind the carriage house, waiting for the two American spies. We curled our thumbs and forefingers and held them to our eyes as binoculars. "Hey," Elgar whispered. "Yeah," I whispered back. "My mom told me to ask you, how do you feel being a Negro?" "I don't know," I said, not as softly. "How come?" "Pretty good, I guess. Here they come." I'm sorry. But that's super awkward. You would have to check your see, that was back in like what, the 1960s, 70s, something like that. So questions like that could be asked because back then, it was segregated America, even if segregation wasn't legally enforced back then by the 70s, culturally and still today in America, like black people and white people in a lot of parts are very separated, right? Like there's probably a guy or girl living in North Dakota, Iowa, whatever, that has never seen a black person in person, right? Like it's very possible, I think. So it's very funny that mom would say, "Hey, your little black friend, Wilderson, the Wilderson boy. Yeah, ask him how he feels about being black." Like, "Mom, read a book." I'm sorry, that's funny. That's funny. So Oscar and Liam were on the move. We caught Liam, but Oscar made it to Checkpoint Charlie in the McDermott's backyard. The next time I saw Elgar, he told me his mom didn't like my answer. I was worried. I asked him if she was mad. No, he told me. I asked him, was he sure? Sure. "I'm sure," he said. "She wants you to come to lunch." I said, "Okay, but I'd have to ask my mom." Selena Davenport was visibly taller than her husband, Elgar Sr. She didn't have red hair like Elgar Jr. or Elgar Sr. Before we sat down to lunch, she brought me to the living room and she showed me the mantle with her tennis trophies from a college she said was one of the Seven Sisters back east, where they didn't have any boys. In her husky, dry martini voice, she said the place had her climbing the walls. "Elgar knows how I climb the walls," she said, mussing his hair. She led us to the kitchen. I was so uptight about being there, and I didn't know why, that I was only half listening to her, which meant I only half understood what she meant. But I had been taught that when you don't know what to say to someone, rather than let uncomfortable dead air pass between you, you ask them a question. So I asked her why she wanted to climb the walls. She looked at me as though I'd asked her if they ate cat food for dinner. Then she laughed and called her maid, Mrs. Siamansky, to serve lunch. We ate in the kitchen, Selena Davenport, Elgar, and me. Mrs. Siamansky set a platter of sandwiches on the table and poured lemonade for Elgar and me. Mrs. Davenport drank lemonade too, but with a splash of gin. As covertly as I could, I lifted one edge of the bread to have a look. I wasn't covert enough. "Something wrong with the sandwich, Frankie?" Mrs. Davenport asked me. "He doesn't like that name, Mom." "What name do you like?" "Frank," I said, trying not to sound cross like Elgar. I know where this is going. Black people, we always say, "Hey, don't go to people's houses and eat their foods." I don't know where that came from. I don't know why we're always like that. But especially if we go to white people's houses, it's always like, we got to check that shit. You know what I mean? You can't just be eating random mayo sandwiches. That's wild. Acne says they put only mayo in their sandwich. I know. You were thinking the same thing too. Yeah, that's a mayo sandwich. But yeah, black people, even black people that would come to my home, and I think this is a black people thing, like no matter what, like you don't go eating everybody's food, is what I heard growing up. Even when we go to other people's homes, don't be eating everybody's food. Maybe drink some tea, have some coffee. But yeah, go into a white folks home, that's a mayo sandwich waiting for you. Anyway, so, Frank, I said, trying not to sound cross like Elgar. Your mother calls you Frankie when she calls you to come inside. This startled me because I didn't know she knew my mother. I knew she knew of my mother, but the Davenports had signed a petition of 500 households to keep us out of Kenwood, and most of the neighbors never spoke to my mother. I didn't say anything. She asked again, "What's wrong with the sandwich, Frank?" "Nothing, Mrs. Davenport. Tell me, I won't be offended if you don't like my sandwiches." The irony of this statement slipped past me at the time because they weren't her sandwiches. Mrs. Saminsky made them. I wanted to see where the meat was so I could move it to the middle. This tickled Elgar's mom. It's an Italian sandwich, provolone, spinach, and tomatoes, all with a little pesto. You'll bloat if you eat meat in this heat. That's what my mom says, I said. She makes these sometimes. Does she now? Mrs. Davenport nodded and lit a Pall Mall. Don't torture yourself. You don't have to eat it, she said. This was a momentary reprieve from a death sentence until I remembered my mother told me to be on my best behavior. I took a generous bite. Nausea toyed with my intestines as I tried to swallow. The mayonnaise. The mayonnaise, the mayonnaise, the rubbery cheese, and the acidic tomatoes, all combined with that touch of pesto, struggled down my esophagus in doughy, half-chewed wads. I don't think I've ever mixed mayo with pesto. That's a wild combination. I'm sorry. That is wild to mix mayo with pesto. I think every person in America has that trauma of first being introduced to white people food. When you are first introduced to white people food, it is a traumatic experience that you never forget. And I'm not surprised it came up in chapter 2 of this story talking about Afro-Pessimism. He's like, damn, white people been around us this long and still make mayo sandwiches with pesto. Anyway, then Selena Davenport asked the question Elgar had asked me at the carriage house by the Berlin Wall. In a chair directly opposite to me, she sipped her lemonade and gin, took another drag of her cigarette, and looked directly at me as she waited for me to answer. I stopped eating. I would never hire a man who salts his food before eating, one of my father's axioms. It means don't act or speak in haste, Frankie. If you don't know the answer, think. Take a moment to figure out what's being asked. I took in the room. Her lace curtains billowing in the breeze through the kitchen and windows, her polished green gas range with gold antique knobs, her fridge air that gleamed like Marvel Comics Silver Surfer, with an ice maker in the door, along with a water dispenser so that ice and water could be dispensed without having to open the appliance, something I had never seen before. Her white pleated tennis skirt, white sneakers, her well-toned legs, and the way she waited without blinking. She stares like an East German border guard. The wrong answer, and you won't make it back. She's not just a pretty tennis lady. Those aren't just pretty tennis shoes. There are razor blades in the toes of her shoes, and she will kick you in the shin if you forget what Dad said and speak in haste. Mom, said Elgar, I already told you what he said. I can't trust you to bring the right change home, Elgar. Pretty good, I guess. Elgar, that's how you talk. His father's an educator. I meant to say more. I apologized. Of course you did. Elgar didn't give you the chance. She looked pleased. I wanted her to stay that way. Every spy knows how to keep the guards smiling. I told her it was nice to be a Negro. She blew yet another thin cyclone of smoke. She didn't look pleased. So I told her Negroes get to do cool stuff. So I told her Negroes get to do cool stuff. Like what? She said, more alert. I was stumped. So I told her about Mason Gate Resort on Gull Lake near Brainerd, Minnesota. I said our family and a bunch of other Negro families spend a week there every August, fishing, boating, swimming, and water skiing. She knew of Mason Gate Resort, but something in my story didn't gel with what she knew of it. She asked me if I was confusing Mason Gate Resort with someplace else. She stood up and leaned on the counter with her back to the window. She lit another cigarette with the first and flicked the stub of the first one out the window. What would Smokey the Bear say? Elgar asked with alarm. You'll make someone a good wife one day, Elgar, she said, but she was looking someone a good wife one day. Anyway, but she was looking at me. The first and only time she took her eyes off me was when she used her lighter to light her first cigarette. Now she took her eyes off me again and exhaled to the side. When she looked at me again, there was still no warmth in her face. I was lying and she knew it. We didn't stay at Mason Gate Resort. We stayed at Twilight Loon Cabins, 2 miles away from Mason Gate, on the side of the lake with marshes where sandy beaches should be, a part of the lake where there was no speedboats, no Grand Lodge with nightly entertainment, no water sports like jet skiing, no elegant restaurants serving walleyed pike and roast potatoes. Instead of Mason Gate's lush air-conditioned rooms, Twilight Loon Cabins had self-catering cabins with screen doors in the need of paint, and the sound of the closing slapped across the lake. The ground's lights were so far apart that at night you need a flashlight to walk from one cabin to the next. It was only the previous year, 1966, that the 4 Negro families had begun taking the kids up to Mason Gate to have dinner and enjoy the activities there. We didn't stay there, however, and something told me Mrs. Davenport knew. She doused the new cigarette under the tap. Elgar Sr. doesn't think the Twins will make the World Series this year, she said, as though she were talking to someone who wasn't in the room. She ran a glass of water from the tap and drank some of it. Where's his home team spirit? Interesting. Very interesting story. I've never had something like that where a white person is like questioning me about my blackness. Never. I've never had that happen. I think it's because I look scary as fuck. So like a lot of white people maybe don't want to ask me because they maybe think, oh, that's an angry black man already. We know what he's going to say. He's going to say he hates white people or something. Maybe I carried it on my face. I carry it on my face already. They see, oh, that guy really hates white people. So they don't even ask me this shit. But Frank, this is the thing. I think some black people get tested because they just have that sort of face and demeanor that allows white people to just do whatever. You get what I'm saying? Or say whatever. Like unless I'm being assaulted, like you've seen on video, like Albanians yelling N words like at me in the street. I've never had white people feel so comfortable around me just to drop the N-bomb around me. You get what I'm saying? And I think some black people just have that demeanor about them that feels like they give permission to white people. All right. Anyway, going here to the comments. Acty says 70s and 80s housewives suck. They are scary alcoholics. Housewives who are like just plotting on killing this family. And yeah, it sounds like one of those ladies in the story. And yeah, hella scary. Very scary. Another thing that I wanted to say about this. Oh, I didn't want it to skip my mind. But yeah, man, there was another thing I wanted to say about his Catholicism. He started up this chapter. He started this chapter by talking about, you know, his mother was Catholic. She was a part of the choir and he was like an altar boy and stuff like that. I was never an altar boy, but my mother was Catholic, went to Catholic church. And during communion, you know, you eat it from the hand of the people, usually the father, I think. I haven't been to mass in a long time, but it was very interesting, you know, having that picture he painted of, you know, being the priest feeding people the blood and body of Christ, and they're confessing their sins of anti-Blackness. It was just very powerful imagery that lasted in my mind. I have to say this. This guy is an excellent writer. Continuing here in the story. So, goops of mayonnaise, cheese, tomatoes, and raw nerves, all combined with the new sensation of pesto, sloshed in my stomach as I bundled up the hill from Elgar's house to mine. As I came up the back porch stairs, I could hear a Dina Washington song on the radio, S&H green stamps, and a booklet to paste them inlaid on the kitchen table, next to a textbook on statistics for students of psychology. Mom was taking a break from studying and pasting stamps into the book. So she said, "There's no meat in her sandwich." Mom laughed and turned the radio down. "We're in Minnesota," she said, "but we're not of Minnesota. Bull Connor could save money on dogs if he'd had that woman's food." Mom, yes, nothing. What is it? How do you feel? I feel like I should be on my veranda with a mint julep, fanning myself instead of breaking my brain over statistics or licking S&H green stamps. I hadn't moved. Why do you ask? She was seated just the right height to look me in the eye. So I know what to say next time. What next? Next time Mrs. Davenport asks me how it feels to be a Negro. No, her face was a violent wish. No, she didn't. Oh, no, she didn't. Oh, no. She pressed her palms on the table as though she was about to stand up and go knock Mrs. Davenport out. And then what? She must have thought, because she didn't stand. And then what? She was learning something valuable about white upper crust Northerners, something that she would not have imagined possible before she moved to Kenwood, how one can fight a war by proxy through someone else's child. She knew now how it must feel to be killed by a guided missile. What kind of woman would hurt you through your child? The good, the beautiful, and the true was a Du Boisian axiom that my mother cherished. Those must be our aspirations, and it starts with how you treat people. This long range messing with my mind, and my son, your guided missile. If that's what she thought when I came home, then she also would have reminded the Selena Davenport deep inside her skull how she makes Elgar and all the children in this neighborhood feel at home when she's with them, how she scoops the ice cream cones for them, always a half scoop extra, how she makes red, white, and blue gunboat hats for the kids on the 4th of July and lights their sparklers as they walk up the hill on parade. But you twist my son's stomach into knots. Very, very, very interesting. So what, you know, I didn't think about this now, to be honest. I mean, it is horrific what that mother was doing to young Frank here by making her son ask little black Frank, how does it feel to be a Negro, right? And then brings Frank home and then asks him, how does it feel to be a Negro? No, really, how does it feel to be a Negro? And then Frank goes home and tells his mother, and his mother's like, oh, this woman is trying to remind my son of his blackness in this all white neighborhood that we had to fight to get into. And that's what I wanted to talk about earlier. This skipped my mind, but one of the most annoying comments I get on my channel all the time are people who saying, if you should expect anti-Black racism for traveling or being somewhere. When we come from America, where people had to fight just to live in houses and neighborhoods. Every place in America where there is a Black family living in that place, whether it be an urban center or a suburban center, rural area, white people all came together, collaborated together, protested, firebombed, burned people's houses down to keep Black people out of neighborhoods. Now, with your logic, to the people that come into my comments and saying you shouldn't travel because when anti-Blackness happens to you, you have no reason to complain. What would you tell our ancestors when they were just trying to live in LA, when they were trying to live in Detroit, when they were just trying to get by and build houses in Houston, New York, Philadelphia, anywhere in America where we live? This is what makes me sick about the comment section and also about the mentality that certain Black people have. And also, of course, white supremacists, because this is their default argument too. But anywhere we exist in this world, we will be harassed and bullied and even terrorized. So what should we do? We should straight up kill ourselves. This is why I advocate for Black mass suicide. We should all take guns to our foreheads and blow our fucking brains out. I'm serious as fuck. Because there is nowhere in this world we can exist without getting harassed. Period. 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 All of us, as a collective, as Black men, should straight up fucking kill ourselves. There is no reason to exist in this planet if all people are going to say is anywhere you go, you will be harassed. So do not be there. Kill ourselves is what we should do. Period. Period. Anybody who says this to me, that's my automatic response. Because it makes no fucking sense how people can come and tell me, oh, you traveled to X country or X place and you faced anti-Black harassment. And when you speak about it, you should feel stupid and ashamed. Meanwhile, our ancestors were just trying to live in our own country, in our own places, and everywhere we went, we were harassed. So tell them also not to move. Tell the Wilderson family not to fucking try to build a better life for themselves. You get what I'm saying? We should straight up kill ourselves. Honestly. Anyway, I'm sorry for ranting. That touched a nerve with me, and I just have to continue in the book. Anyway, one night when I was older and almost living on my own, I came home late and quietly. Mother was alone in the dark in front of a fire. Dad was stretched out on the sofa asleep. The soft glow in the fireplace was the only light. She was sticking needles into little stuffed cloth dolls, naming them with the names of two of her white coworkers. And this one, she said deliciously as she stabbed the doll, I leave shaking with the palsy. I smiled and went up to bed without her knowing I had seen her. She's sane, I thought as I climbed into bed. After all she's been through, she's sane. This guy Frank and I, we are the same. Like we deal, we come home, we got a black woman who's so pissed off about the white women around her in her lives, and she's like making like voodoo dolls. Like my mama didn't do that, though that would make sense because my mama was from like Belize and shit like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if she practiced some voodoo. You get what I'm saying? That's hilarious. Yeah, if you don't have a black parent that comes home and complains about white people, you didn't realize you didn't have the true black experience. You didn't have the true black experience if your daddy didn't come home one day, slammed the door behind him, and said, "These goddamn crackers." If your mama didn't come home and say, "These white people," just have like a glass of Chardonnay or something, man, you didn't have the true black experience. Anyway, continuing here. All right. The next time we played Secret Agent at the mansion across the street, I drew a Soviet straw. Again, I complained. Liam Gunderson was a Soviet agent with me, Elgar, and Oscar were MI6 agents. I caught Elgar at the Berlin Wall and locked him in the guardhouse with its imaginary walls of air. I dashed along the fence to help Liam catch Oscar before he crossed into West Berlin. I hadn't gotten far when I heard Elgar yell. I escaped. His short, stout body rolled over the fence. I yelled back, "You're caught. You have to stay in the guardhouse," he yelled. "You didn't handcuff me." He was over the fence now, dashing through the McDermott's backyard on his way back to the Tyson's backyard. I was livid. "Don't run, fuckface." His red hair flounced in the wind. He turned his freckled face around and laughed. My foot nudged something solid on the ground next to the fence. It was a plastic bottle of emerald-colored palm olive dish soap. I bent down and picked it up. Its heft in my hand was substantial because it was nearly full. I gripped the bottle by its neck. I felt my arm sling back. Then it slung forward. End over end, the green bottle whirled, now a tomahawk, now a wand, as it shot toward the sun. The high noon light prismed in the green liquid until the bottle disappeared in the jaws of the sun. I closed my eyes so as not to go blind. Plop, splat. Elgar's knees buckled. He was face down in the McDermott's backyard. We raced to his side. Green dish soap oozed into the grass from a crack in the plastic bottle. Blood oozed from the back of Elgar's skull. A temple of his Coke bottle glasses was torn from its hinges and lay beside his head on the ground. But the word blood took a few moments to find me. At first, what I saw on the back of his skull was a cowlick, a red tuft of hair gone awry. Then I saw it as a small spurt of water, like the spurts of water from the fountain outside of Mrs. Anderson's room, that was so small your lips touched the faucet with your drink when you drank. Sorry. Liam and Oscar ran for help. I stood there, the sun beating down upon my neck, my eyes beating down upon Elgar as he bled. It would be wrong to say that I meant to hurt him, but now that he was hurt, I didn't want to help him. I knew that I should want to help him, but that was knowledge stripped of desire, and it voiced itself in the second and third persons. You should want to help him, or the Wilderson boy should want to help him. Voices up the back stairs and a little to the left of what I really felt. The tiny gurgle of blood from the soft spot in the back of his head died within seconds. But I stood there waiting for the tiny geyser's return. Elgar Davenport bleeds. If Elgar bleeds, his mother bleeds. Until that point, people around me in Kenwood seemed bloodless and eternal. 3 years later, in the spring of 1970, when we lived in Berkeley, a Black Panther handed me Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth in a study session that he and others held for junior high kids. That night, I read what I could of concerning violence, where Fanon wrote about the moment that the natives of Algeria sees the French settler bleed, that moment when the Algerian finds out that the settler's skin is not any more value than a native skin. And it must be said that this discovery shakes the world in a very necessary manner. And I thought of that day with Elgar. I felt a twinge between my legs, the same twinge of bliss I felt at night when, half asleep and half awake, I wet the bed, the pleasure of release that could last until I felt the wet spot. When the paramedics parsed the story, one said to the other, landed on the fontanelle. Explains the bleeding as his partner nodded. On the 3 count, they hoisted Elgar onto the gurney. One of them said Elgar was lucky his fontanelle wasn't as soft as a baby's, or the injury would have been far worse. Elgar's eyes were open, but he didn't say anything. The first paramedic shook his head. What are the chances? 1 in a million, not even. When I saw Mrs. Davenport pleading with the paramedics to let her ride in the ambulance, I knew my parents would beat me, but they didn't beat me. They were. I'm sorry, that's hilarious. I knew my parents would beat me for making this little white boy bleed, but they didn't, though. Creating the permission structure. Creating the permission structure. This is great. This is. I got to read that again. When I saw Mrs. Davenport pleading with the paramedics to let her ride in the ambulance, I knew my parents would beat me, but they didn't beat me. They were too dazed, their arms too limp and useless to lift something as heavy as a belt. Not only was I not spanked, but my parents didn't even punish me. Shout out to the Wilderson. Karma comes back around. Fuck Afro-Pessimism. We're Afro-optimists. What goes around comes around. You harass little black boys, watch what happens to your kids. You harass little black boys, watch what happens to your kids. You harass little black boys, watch what happens to your kids. The next day, they were still shaken, but not enough to keep them from differing over how Elgar's injury should be explained to me. My father, who knew Latin and who had taught speed reading to corporate executives to earn money while he earned his PhD, talked to me like I was one of his graduate students. A space in the skull where ossification is not complete, Frankie, and the natural structures haven't been formed. The baby's soft spot, Mom said, sighing. Talking goo goo gaga won't improve his vocabulary. Ida Lorraine, Dad frowned. She said we'd have to go over to the Davenport's house together. But before we did, she wanted me to tell them again what had happened. They sat side by side on the sofa in the living room. I stood before them. I told them everything all over again. How Elgar was captured at the Berlin Wall, how Elgar broke the rules when he left the guardhouse, how I reached down and snagged a dish soap bottle by the neck. And I threw it, not at him, Mom. I just threw it. My dad had quit smoking cigarettes several years ago. He was trying to give up his pipe. It was unlit. With his mouth closed over it, he gnawed its stem gently. He looked at me as though I were one of the children in the psych ward he once managed, a mixture of admiration and horror. 20 yards or more, and you cracked his fontanelle? Dad almost smiled. His voice was strange, as though he were talking about someone who had broken a track and field record. I looked at my mother. I didn't mean it, Mom. Then I sobbed. She held me. I know, she said. You're a good boy. I know how bad you felt. When she said this, I recalled how my first burst of feelings had not been kin to remorse. But how could I tell her and still be a good boy? Mom baked a casserole with extra ground beef and extra cheese. I told her, Mrs. Davenport doesn't serve heavy food. I said it 3 times, and each time Mom told me, it's the thought that counts. Mom said this without looking at me. Looking back, I wondered if the thought that counts had more to do with Mrs. Davenport's interrogation of me and less to do with my attack on her son. Or perhaps the two were inextricably bound. Instead of slapping you into next week, I baked a meal you can choke on. Bon appetit. I love these parents. This is top tier Black parenting. Top tier Black parenting. Absolutely. Mom and I walked down the hill to the Davenports. Elgar was still in the hospital under observation, but Mrs. Davenport said he was fine. I told Mr. and Mrs. Davenport how sorry I was, which was true, but there was another truth that couldn't be spoken, not even to my parents. What, I wondered, between regret and desire would come of this duel in the heart. Anyway. Going to the comment section, my guy Craig Matt says, what up, Simon? Just checking in to hit the like button. Catch your next live request. Liberal women boycotting relations with men because they voted Trump. I saw that video on Twitter, and I need to get off Twitter so much. Yeah, I saw that video of some white woman saying no men will get pussy for the next 4 years because of what happened. We're still going to get pussy. We're still going to get pussy. And women love patriarchy. Women love white supremacy. Women love big white cock. So, yeah, these bitches gonna get fucked. Let's keep it a buck. That's gonna happen. So don't believe the lies. In about a week or so, a month or so, some major story will happen, and we'll be back in celebrity world. Like, we're all sort of disheartened that racism, white supremacy, nationalism, xenophobia seems to still reign supreme and will reign supreme for this next century. Because what Trump will do in these 4 years will have impacts on my grandkids. That's how big of a deal it was. What Trump will do in these 4 years will have impacts on my grandkids. That's how big of a deal it was. And I'm repeating that for emphasis. But these hoes still gonna get fucked. Life will go on. A million years from now, nobody will even care. Um, Epic things have happened in history. The walls of Jericho fell. The walls of Constantinople fell. And we rebuild. And horrific things happen. That's not giving up to nihilism. That's not giving up and having a pessimistic worldview. That's just realism and understanding that, things take time. The arc of the universe does not always bend towards justice. I don't truly believe that. I'm making that clear. If I ever said that before, then I take it back. But yeah, I mean, shit, these hoes gonna get dick. These hoes gonna get fucked, right? That's it. That's it. I think interracial relationships, though, will go back 1,000 years. Women are gonna start clinging to white men like never before. I saw a video last night on Twitter of this racist white man harassing the Mexican workers at Five Guys Burgers and Fries, and he was calling spics and all that sort of stuff. The white man was saying that in the video, and he had a little Asian wife just standing there videotaping everything, right? And yeah, that's Trump's America. This is our country now. This is our world now. It's just explicitly anti-black, explicitly like anti-woman. Women might say, "Oh no, we totally disagree, man. White women love Trump. White women love big white cock." I mean, that's just what it is, man. That's just what the world is. Continuing here. I survived the next year, 1968, on quotations from film stars, espionage novels, and by the end of August, quotations from Chairman Mao. A monk with malachite beads, I clenched the words of others, but of my graceless lurch through that white grammar school, was it Stevenson or Poe or another wine and revolver scribe, I pledged to memory and took to my mother. Before a man dies, he must write a book, love a woman, and kill a man. Who says this? Who says that? I want to write a book. I've loved many a woman, but I found the best woman. But kill a man, I don't want to kill anybody. She eyed me as though I were a parcel intended for the neighbors. You mean, what does it mean? She asked. No, I mean, is it true? We were alone. Windows in the living room were open. The drapes shuddered softly, refusing to say why she looked away. In 1968, something cracked inside of me. I still lay in the dark on the living room floor listening to music as I did the summer before when I was 11. But Gregorian chants have been replaced by the music and the voice of Curtis Mayfield, urging me to be a winner of the good black earth. The first time I heard Curtis Mayfield sing, "No more tears do we cry, and we finally dried our eyes," I wept. I thought if I listened long and hard enough, Curtis Mayfield's voice would strain, clear and fierce, through the phonograph needle and shield me from a hell of people, from a hell people said I was blessed to inhabit. There are boys in the ghetto who don't have it this good. Oh yeah. Definitely heard that growing up. I mean, you can't help but think, growing up in like suburban, rural America, like, suburban America, like how I grew up, like I had like the stereotypical American childhood, 2 cars in a car garage, big front yard, big backyard, a dog in the back. My parents had 2.5 kids, that sort of stuff, right? Like prototypical American stuff. But when you inhabit that world as a young black boy and you realize that all the other black kids live on the other side of the tracks, on the other side of town, you think like, damn, why do we have it this good? Or do we have it even worse? You get what I'm saying? So definitely can relate a lot to Frank's story. Anyway, as the year began, the Tet offensive laid siege to our living room. Just before midnight, our living room crackled with white noise as my parents, thinking they were alone, searched for a signal on the radio in the hi-fi. Sometimes I hid on the front staircase and tried to get a glimpse of them through the spindles of the balustrade. They often sat on the floor. I could see their outstretched legs. I didn't dare go below the first landing for fear of being spotted, and the first landing was close enough for me to hear the radio and wait for my uncle's name in the call of the dead. The music stopped. The DJ announced that the station would soon be signing off. But first, the nightly bulletin from Vietnam. A mechanized infantry convoy from the 2nd Brigade, U.S. 4th Infantry Division, was ambushed 2 miles northwest of Ple Mirong in Komtun Province. Convoy security elements returned the enemy fire while Army helicopter gunships and artillery supported the action. A UH-1 helicopter was hit by enemy ground fire and crashed in the area, wounding all 5 persons on board. Then the roll came. At this point, the clink of ice in my mother's cola stopped. The bones of my father dried in my bones. They didn't move. They seemed not to breathe. The only living thing was the radio. Go into the comments. Craig Matt says, I didn't vote. Last time I did was in 89 for my high school, for my high coach. These elections are out of control. I think your guy won, Craig Matt, because all of my commenters in my comment section, like Craig Mack, Avery Adams, Mad Villainy, the people that I can think of right now, they're all like right wing. So Craig Mack, I think your guy won. So you should be happy. I think you should be happy that Trump won and everybody else out there, because we hate immigrants, right? We're racist, we're xenophobic, we want to kick the fucking immigrants out, even though we work them as slaves to make sure that we can have food on our tables. Fuck the immigrants. We hate women too. Yeah, let them bitches die having miscarriages. Yeah, fuck them bitches. You know what I mean? We're so gung-ho on bringing back manufacturing from like the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that we're going to raise tariffs high as hell and make everything super expensive, because everybody who voted for Trump said, well, eggs are $8 a dozen now. So yeah, Craig Mack, you should be happy. But we don't care. We're black men living abroad, right? Who gives a fuck about, our parents, our brothers, our sisters, our mothers, back home? Who cares, right? So all my followers are right wing, so y'all should be happy. Y'all should be happy. I'm not going to cry no liberal tears because I'm a goddamn communist, and we know hard. We know hard. Communists know hard. I'm prepared to go to the gulag. You get what I'm saying? Like, liberal tears are not what you'll see on this channel. But Craig Mack, you should be happy. And Avery Adams, y'all should be happy. Y'all are about to get what you want. Y'all are about to get what you want. So whatever. So Tuesday, August 29th, the announcer paused. Was he sipping water? Was his right hand on the mic and his left hand cupped over a cough? 240 servicemen have died in combat this week. We close this broadcast, as we close every evening, with the names of those who have fallen today, followed by a sampling of the message our listeners have left on our answering machine. The views and opinions do not reflect the views and opinions of the management here at WGBH, nor the views and opinions of the stations that broadcast this show. Specialist William C. Gehring, 22, East Lansing, Michigan. Lance Corporal Joseph L. Rhodes, 22, Memphis, Tennessee. Captain Michael C. Volheim, 20, Hayward, California, etc., etc. I don't want to read all those names. I'm just going to skip. So after the announcer read the names, his voice continued in its bedside manner, as though tucking the dead soldiers into bed. Now, he said soothingly, a selection of your voices from our parent studio. A small beep as he pressed a button to play the messages from the station's answering machine. A woman with a Cold Town twang thanked the station for telling her of her son's death 2 days before the Marines came knocking at her door. It meant she didn't crumple to the floor when they came. She had done that already in private. Her neighbors down the way had slumped on her porch at those 2 Marines' feet. It's a shame, she said. They're not allowed to hold you or pick you up off the floor. Thank you for sparing me that indignity. A man from Tulia, Texas, demanded the station stop reading the names on the air. You are supporting the anti-war demonstrators who are traitors to this nation. A girl from Seattle said 2 nights ago she heard the name of someone who graduated last year from her high school. He scored the winning touchdown when we won homecoming. We think we should cancel the homecoming parade this year and hold a candlelight vigil instead. Please advise. A woman from Ohio said, I'm a white woman, but I always wonder how many Southern black boys lay claim to the names you read each night. What did they die for? Tar paper shacks, malnutrition, degradation, and no jobs? Please, somebody tell me. Shout out Becky. Shout out Becky from Ohio. That's an ally. That's a writer. There were allies even back then. The problem is there's just not enough of those white folks. There's not enough white folks that are people that are racialized as white with the conscience. There are not enough white people. There are not enough people that are racialized as white with the conscience. There are not enough people who are racialized as white with the conscience. I heard the clink of ice as my mother dared to sip her cola again. Your brother's alive, she said softly. My father said, yes, another day of life. I heard them saying there, our fathers together, and I knew they were on their knees. One of Dad's students fled to Canada to dodge the draft. The Canadians took him in, no questions asked. I wondered if they'd take me in, no questions asked, if I fled my war in Kenwood. I turned 12 in April, the same day Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, and 7 days after the murder of Martin Luther King. I watched the riots on television with my grandmother, a New Orleans Catholic who had taught second grade and at one time played piano with the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. Grandmother Jules loved all kinds of sports. Her husband, Tutu Jules, named for his ability to strike out a batter every time the call was 2 balls and 2 strikes, turned down an invitation to join the Negro National League and worked the rails as a porter and then as a plasterer when the Great Depression came. But he was dead in 1968. When grandmother Jules came north to visit us, she spent time with me and my father watching baseball, football, and basketball, and never hunted for antiques with my mother, her daughter. She loved pickled pig's feet and a beer called Hams, which was brewed across the river in St. Paul. The murder of Martin Luther King and the Tet Offensive changed my family's relationship to radio and TV. My parents listened for my uncle's name in the nightly broadcasts of casualties. My grandmother and I watched the riots. One night, her feet shot up from the easy chair and damn near knocked her beer and pig's feet off the TV dinner tray. As I steadied the table, she laughed like I'd never seen her laugh before. "Go ahead, son," she cried. I heard her say this many times over whenever Tony Oliva made a base hit or when Gail Sayers ran for a touchdown, but neither Oliva nor Sayers were on the screen. I caught her joy and laughed out loud too. A knot loosened in my chest, a phantom tumor that had been there since first grade. We were watching the riots and my grandmother laughed my pain away. If I said that for the past 6 years, I'd hated the vast majority of students and half the teachers at my school, I would be lying. It was never that straightforward. But it would be accurate to say that I was never at ease in their presence. And since their faces were with me, even when I was not with them, it would also be true to say that I was seldom, if ever, at ease. "Go ahead, son." She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to the man on the screen. But at the moment, she and I were triangulated with that man on the screen, and I felt loved. I'd like to say the city on the screen was Cleveland, but it could have been Detroit, DC, Cincinnati, Chicago, Kansas City, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, Trenton, New Jersey, or Wilmington, Delaware. It could have been anywhere and everywhere. No fires were visible, but smoke plumed over ruined buildings. Skid marks scarred the streets where a shirtless man with a do-rag snapped around his conch nosed a shopping cart down the boulevard. Grandmother Jules laughed like her chest was full of carbonation. I knew there and then that for me, the priesthood was dead. I was going to grow up to be a looter and make my grandma proud. Shout out to Big Mama. Man, I don't feel like my generation, we saw any massive like riots on screen. Like somebody's going to bring up the George Floyd riots. That wasn't like 1992. That's not like LA. That's not like the Watts riots. That's not like the New Orleans riots, which they don't teach about, right? Like my generation didn't grow up seeing like Black people on screen, like just running into the stores and like stealing everything, like as a part of like the civil breakdown because of injustice done to us, right? So I like that grandma here in this story is just like, go ahead, boy, steal that TV. Go ahead, boy. Just take that microwave or toaster. You get what I'm saying? Like, yeah, like that was a different era, right? Like we think we're living through some ish right now. Black people in like the 60s and 70s and stuff like that, they were watching wild stuff on TV. They were a part of some wild stuff. You get what I'm saying? Like, so it's never as bad as you think it is. That's hilarious. That's a hilarious story. That's a hilarious story. My generation, I feel like we've only grown up seeing things on TV that are horrific, like George Floyd's murder, or hearing about Trayvon's story, or Sean Bell's story, or any of the other martyrs that have fallen. Tamir Rice's story. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, I'm continuing here. So our racket roused the killjoy giants who owned the house. My mother came downstairs and told her mother not to say such things. I saw my mother in silhouette frames by the living room's sliding French doors with light from the dining room at her back. She was graceful even when she was still. She and Dad modeled in fashion shows that the Boule and the Lynx, two of the black middle-class social groups to which they belonged, put on. The whole room hushed when the two of them came down the catwalk. Mom's friends said she looked like Danielle Luna, who took the world by storm in 1966 when she became the first black woman to grace the cover of Vogue. And I struggled to see how the blood in my mother's light skin and slender body was the same blood that ran through my grandmother, who was short and dark, sucked juice from a neck bone, and stomped the damper pedal when she played the piano. At the age of 36, my mother stood in the threshold, framed by her reproach, and spoke to her 63-year-old mother as though their ages were reversed. My grandmother and I looked at her like two kids caught being naughty. Don't say that, mother. Next thing you know, he'll be saying that at school. He's wayward enough as it is. When we turned back to the television, the man with the conch, the do-rag, and the shopping cart was gone. My mom went upstairs and we went back to our antics. Why are we mad? I asked my grandmother as we gazed at the plumes of smoke rising from the flat roofs. Because we ain't got no jobs, I said, giggling and looking cautiously out the French doors for signs of my mother and her citation for ain'ts. No, grandmother replied, it's not about jobs. Because we ain't got no hot water, it's not about water, child. Because we live in the ghetto, Frankie, you're not in the ghetto, she said with a chuckle, and you're mad. How she knew that was a mystery to me, for I don't recall ever telling her what went on at school. Shout out to all the old black women that just know what you feeling. She's like, baby, you're not even in the ghetto, and we know you a mad nigga. Like, for real. That's hilarious. That's hilarious. Man, I miss my grandma. I miss my grandma. Both of my grandmas. I miss both of my grandmas, man. Like that generation of black folk that lived to tell the tale of surviving the worst of white supremacy and still got to see vicious white supremacy, but then got to see some progress in their lifetime. There'll never be another. There will never be another. They would have to bring slavery back for us to reach like the levels that our grandparents had. You know what I'm saying? Like, God, they were so full of wisdom. They would have to bring literal slavery back for us to be as wise and all-knowing and compassionate and great as our grandparents, man. That's what they would have to do. Anyway, then on the count of three, we said, we're mad at the world. Yes, this is a little tears coming to my eye. From the top of the staircase, we heard, Mother, please. It would, though, be a stretch to say that my grandmother was an Afro-pessimist. But Afro-pessimism isn't a church to pray at or a party to be voted in and out of office. Afro-pessimism is black people at their best. Mad at the world is black folks at their best. Afro-pessimism gives us the freedom to say out loud what we would otherwise whisper or deny, that no blacks are in the world, but by the same token, there is no world without blacks. The violence perpetrated against us is not a form of discrimination. It is a necessary violence, a health tonic for everyone who is not black, and an ensemble of sadistic rituals and captivity that could only happen to people who are not black if they broke this or that law. This kind of violence can happen to a sentient being in one of two circumstances. A person has broken the law, which is to say, cracked out of turn given the rules that govern, or the person is a slave, which is to say, no prerequisites are required for an act of brutality to be incurred. There is no antagonism like the antagonism between black people and the world. This antagonism is the essence of what Orlando Patterson calls social death or deathliness, in the words of David Marriott. It is the knowledge and experience of day-to-day events in which the world tells you you are needed as the destination for its aggressivity and renewal. Never heard that word before. Aggressivity. Okay, maybe aggression would have been better. Continuing here. The antagonism between the post-colonial subject and the settler, the Sand Creek Massacre or the Palestinian Nakba, cannot and should not be analogized with the violence of social death. That is the violence of slavery, which did not end in 1865 for the simple reason that slavery did not end in 1865. Slavery is a relational dynamic, not an event, and certainly not a place in space like the South, just as colonialism is a relational dynamic. And that relational dynamic can continue to exist once the settler has left or ceded governmental power. And these two relations are secured by radically different structures of violence. Afro-pessimism offers an analytical lens that labors as a corrective to humanist assumptive logics. It provides a theoretical apparatus that allows Black people to not have to be burdened by the ruse of analogy, because analogy mystifies rather than clarifies Black suffering. Analogy mystifies Black people's relationship to other people of color. Afro-pessimism labors to throw this mystification into relief without fear of the faults and fissures that are revealed in the process. Very, very interesting here. I never thought about this before. Shout out Frank B. Wilderson. Slavery is not, an event, because slavery did not end in 1865. That is a very important point. There are still places in the world where actual literal slavery is happening and still enforced. Slavery is a relational dynamic. It is not a point or place in time or an institution, right? It can be institutionalized, but it is a relational dynamic the same way colonialism is, and it can morph and change. The same way we think about colonialism, then there was actual colonialism where the European powers controlled lands in Africa. There can be neo-colonialism where it's not the nations of Europe that control Africa, but the corporations or the ideologies that permeate in Africa. So there can be neo-colonialism. We as Black people in America could be exhibiting or living in neo-slavery to some degree, under neo-colonialism and also neo-slavery. Very, very, very interesting that Afro-pessimism creates that sort of framework or that sort of possibility to imagine Blackness in its current state. Very interesting. Let's continue here. Grandmother Jules would turn in her grave to know I thought of her as an Afro-pessimist. She was a Catholic woman whose confessions never lapsed. But once she retired, her speech was relieved of the ruse of analogy, which meant she could let herself say that we weren't mad for the reasons people who suffered class oppression, gender discrimination, or colonial domination were mad. Their anger had grounding wires internal to the world. We were the world's grounding wire. We were the targets of rage that would otherwise be turned in on itself. Black people were the living, breathing contradistinction to life itself. And when we were too old, like Grandmother Jules, or were too young, like me, to know what my mother knew, we refused the rules of analogy and let our rage speak its truth. Human life is dependent on Black death for its existence and for its coherence. Blackness and slaveness are inextricably bound in such a way that whereas slaveness can be separated from Blackness, Blackness cannot exist as other than slaveness. There is no world without Blacks, yet there are no Blacks who are in the world. You had to be young or you had to be old for the Eucharist to touch your lips. Very, very profound, very profound. A schism soon wedged between my parents and me. I had more contempt than compassion for them. My mother was finishing her PhD, and sometime during this period, she worked as a public school administrator for the Minneapolis Public Schools. My father was a professor and associate dean at the University of Minnesota. Both of my parents were psychologists who, in addition to laboring as academics during the day, held down a private practice, and they threw themselves into MLK's dream of racial equality and Lyndon Johnson's dream of a great society. This meant that they lent their skills as grant writers to grassroots initiatives and hosted endless social and political gatherings in our large living room, where a patchwork of people who might not have otherwise met, university administrators, liberal businessmen, urban planners, activists, and students, came together to jumpstart job training centers in the Black community, outreach programs for Native Americans, mental health programs for people without means. In 1968, the year the Fair Housing Act was passed, my parents went door to door in Kenwood, handing out leaflets that explained the act in such a way that they hoped would not be threatening and would encourage the same people who worked so hard to keep them out of Kenwood to welcome one or two other Black families with open arms. Look at these COONs. Look at these COONs. How dare they? How dare these Black people pass out petitions and flyers in this mostly all white neighborhood saying, hey, can we allow more Black people to come in? Can we allow more Black people to have good housing? Can we allow Black people to be able to live wherever they want in the country that they built? How dare they? Those are some COONs, as people have called me, for just wanting to travel and spend my money and be where I want to be. Our ancestors were COONs, according to the logic of a lot of you Negroes out there, and of course, the white supremacists. Very, very disappointing that our ancestors would even bother lobbying to fight for their dignity, to have the right to live where they want. How dare they? They shouldn't have even learned how to read. Those stupid, stupid Negroes. Continuing here. They conducted several fair housing workshops in the homes of wealthy Kenwoodites and asked them to drive the wooden stakes of fair housing signs in their lawns. It soon became clear that the demographic of these workshops were white women whose husbands were away at the office. The housewives loved my dad and tolerated my mother, even though they both were beautiful. My dad was over 6 feet tall. In marble foyers, he removed his full-length leather coat, where underneath he wore cuff-length shirts and suits that looked tailored. He looked them in the eye when he spoke, and they smiled at him and nodded like supplicants. When it was my mother's turn to speak, their attention waned, and the tinkling of demitasse cups and saucers salted the air. My mom had tried to throw herself into the times as best she could. To this end, she had bought an Afro wig and wore it. Cringe, 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 cringe. Only light-skinned woman that could wear an afro is Angela Davis. Only light-skinned woman that could rock that afro is Angela Davis. Shout out Big Angela. Shout out Big Ange. Big Commie with the small C. But we love her. We love Angela Davis. Anyway, at the end of each workshop, it was time for the big ask. How many of you would like to take the fair housing signs we have in the car and place them on your lawn? A woman raised her hand. Bypassing the issue at hand, she asked my father if he had ever done any modeling. If not, she continued, she knew a man who ran an agency. With a clenched smile, my mom tried to steer the conversation back to fair housing. Another woman raised her hand to concur that dad would be such a handsome model. Then yet another shot up her hand to add that as much as she would like to place one of the signs on her lawn, her husband would not approve. Mom left the room. Bypassing the model suggestion, dad told them that he and mom would be happy to return to anyone's house for a one-on-one with anyone's husband. Mom watched them from the foyer where she sat on the bottom step of the stairs. She removed the afro wig from her head and placed it on the step beside her. That reminds me of there's a movie that Acti and I reviewed, I think earlier this year. When did we start these movie reviews? There's a movie called Jungle Fever by Spike Lee. And in the movie, there's like this conversation that all the black women are having. And the black women are complaining that when they walk down the street with their handsome black men, white women be like throwing themselves at the handsome black men, right? And that's a major issue. That was one of the things I'll never forget from that film. I was wondering, I never forget that part of the film because I wonder why that doesn't happen to me. I know I'm ugly. I'm short, fat, bald, black, broke as hell. You get what I'm saying? So of course that doesn't happen to me. But it was just funny because that reminded me, like this scene right here. This scene right here with his father, trying to give a speech in front of these, desperate white housewives. And all the women are like, you so handsome, you so hot. And the other one raises her hand and says, show me your cock. And this black woman there is like, this is why it was certain like Kamala was not going to get elected, man. White people do not respect black women at all. They were basically throwing the pussy at this woman's husband in front of her. That's disrespectful as hell. I wouldn't be surprised if there are like some white women that sleep with black men just to like spite black women. Like that might be a super small minority, but they might just fuck on a dude just because they hate these black hoes. You get what I'm saying? Why do you want it to happen to you? You got a woman. I know, Acti. I know. I'm saying. I just noticed it doesn't happen to me, and I know why it doesn't happen. That's all. Just a little bit of self-deprecation, and it doesn't happen to you because you don't go out. I be outside all the time. What are you talking about? I'm outside all the time. I'm at school. I go and teach. I be outside. Never had anybody throw the cooch at me. And yes, yeah, just working. Nope. Acti, I be outside. Listen, I don't want attention. And I'm glad I don't get it because God blessed me in a lot of ways. He took my hair. He took my physique. He didn't make me rich. Didn't make me charming. Didn't make me smart. Didn't give me money. So I'm lucky that I'm able to be a noble and honest and good person. I can be a good person because I do not have any of the things that would allow me to be evil. So I look at this as a blessing. I'm still blessed with a beautiful wife. I'm still blessed with the ability to care for myself, the ability to, have these things around me. And I hope God continues to bless me to allow me to have, food, clothing, shelter, electricity, Wi-Fi, safety, security, a warm bed to sleep at night. Thank God. But he didn't give me too much. God didn't give me an extra long big dick. He didn't make me over 6 feet tall. He didn't give me a six pack. He didn't give me like more money than I knew what to do with. So I'm allowed to be a good person. All right. Acty says I'm a handsome man. That's the thing. God gave me the one woman who could find me attractive. God gave me the one woman with a big booty that can throw it back and finds me attractive. So I'm blessed. Alhamdulillah. 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 But this is the thing. This is the thing. A lot of these people out here, they've been too blessed, and God has given them more than what they can handle. You get what I'm saying? Anyway, that wasn't me trying to fish for compliments. That was literally me trying to give a critique of this book, because this is Booked React series. Anyway, so part 5 of chapter 2. The year 1968 was also when the American Indian movement was founded in South Minneapolis, only 3 miles from Kenwood. Overnight, issues of Native American sovereignty and the demands of AIM were part of the University of Minnesota landscape. Dad was running a program on a reservation several miles outside of the city. It was a joint program with the tribal government. The board meetings were held with urban Indians, tribal leaders from the reservation, and Dad in South Minneapolis. As with the fair housing workshops, my parents let me go to these meetings. At once it became clear that the people on the reservation did not want to adhere to some of the requirements of the University of Minnesota, which funded the project. Politically, I thought Dad's institutional interests were wrong and the indigenous people's interests were right. I thought the university should turn over its resources to the Native Americans without insisting that they account for how they spent the money. The room was packed. All 20 of the seats at the large conference table were taken. Another 15 to 20 Native Americans stood against the wall and sat in the deep window sills. Jeers and insults were hurled at my dad whenever he tried to speak, but he never jeered back. There was an effective charge in the room that had more to do with my dad as a Black person than with him being a representative of the university. At one point, a Native man with whom I shared a windowsill seat lurched forward. "We don't want you, a nigger man, telling us what to do." Damn, this Native American was turned up. Little Native American man turned up, yelled at this little boy. "We don't want you, little nigger man, telling us what to do." The crowd walls detonated with applause, and all the Indians and all the white folks cheered. Yeah, yeah. This is the Black-Brown coalition, people. This is the Black-Brown coalition. We should be marching for the Native Americans. We should be marching for the Latinos. We should be marching for the Arabs. And what do they all stand up? "We don't want you, nigger man." God damn. They are wicked. They are literally wicked. They have Satan in their souls. All right. What I couldn't see then, and had no interest in seeing then, was that the wealthy white housewives in the fair housing workshops shared the same psyche space as the Indians in the underserved neighborhoods of South Minneapolis, despite the fact that the women who attended my parents' workshops lived in a part of town as divorced from the streets where AIM was launched, as Atlantis is divorced from Mars. To be sure, the myth of manifest destiny, upon which these white women were weaned from childhood, was inextricably bound to the near annihilation of indigenous life. It would be wrong to say that the white women of Kenwood and the indigenous man seated in the windowsill beside me, who called my dad a nigger, prayed at the same church. But in the final instance, both their worlds were sustained by a need to distinguish themselves from the same alien embodiment. In the plush drawing rooms of Kenwood, the women fed their negrophilia on my father's flesh and pushed my mother to one side. In the tribal meeting hall, the Indians had no use for either of my parents. Whether we are white and wealthy or red and poor, we don't want a nigger telling us what to do. The white woman expressed their refusal to be authorized by Blackness through their unconscious negrophilia. Have you ever been a model, Professor Wilderson? Coupled with a need to remove my mother from scene of their fantasy. The Native Americans expressed their refusal through their unconscious negrophobia. We don't want you, a nigger man, telling us what to do. The force of both white and indigenous effect spoke with one voice, a chorus of libidinal economy. In the collective unconscious of indigenous imagining, the specter of Blackness was a greater threat than the settler institution that had dispatched a Black professor to do its dirty work. So even though this Black man was standing up here saying, "We're with you, we're with the Native Americans, we're trying to fight for your liberation," the white folks came here and exterminated your people, gave you smallpox blankets and all that sort of stuff. And the Indians stood up and said, "Fuck you, nigger." And then you have the white women lusting over this Black man just to spite this Black woman. I mean, come on now. Come on now. Where's this is the thing, we do not have humanity. This is the thing, basically, like black people are not human in the eyes of non-black people. We are not human. We are just objects that exist in the minds of them. Going to the comment from Acti, if they are going to drool over him, then at least give him power. They are so calculated. They're very calculated, very cunning, very conniving. Yeah. Continuing here. My father looked up from the table. He maintained eye contact with the native man seated next to me while the room exploded in his ears. But he did not show anger, and pain appeared in his eyes only after his eyes met mine, with their approval for the voices that jeered him. A father stared into the jeering eyes of his son. I took pleasure in his pain because his ruin made me part of a community. By jeering this nigger, I was one with the we. Afterward, my father and I sat in the car for several minutes. The key was the ignition unturned. The key was in the ignition unturned. He didn't speak to me. My father never showed rage or pain in public, and I was now as much a member of the public as the Indians who drove him from that room. I could see the expansion and contraction of his chest. He let out a long, slow breath. Why not just give them what they want? It's their land. It's their money, I said. He sighed. He sparked the ignition. He put the car in gear. I was too young to know how anti-Blackness is driving the quest for sovereignty as much as it drives the desire to get rid of the settler. And he was too numb to explain. The Native Americans were speaking as sovereigns to one who is not. The essential problem is not in the name they called my dad. That is to say, the essential problem is not in the performance of their antagonistic feelings, but in the structure of an antagonistic relationship between indigenous people with something to salvage and a black person with nothing to lose. My parents carried their rage like vials of nitroglycerin packed in straw. Unlike me, they knew the fallout of black rage. My parents knew and taught the people who were being gunned down and the students who fled to Canada to avoid the draft. And I knew that they themselves were being watched by the FBI. Knowing little of the anvil that weighed on them, thought they were simply sellouts. I thought they held their tongues when their white colleagues made racist statements because they didn't care about the revolution that was raging around them. Slowly, after years of being at odds with them, my view of them changed when I went into academia and was hit firsthand with what Jared Sexton calls the hidden structure of violence that underwrites so many violent acts, whether spectacular or mundane. Dissemblance had been a survival tool, an implement they used to stay alive and put food on our table. They knew that black intellectuals could push the envelope only as far as their non-black interlocutors were willing to accommodate. They also knew that they needed to know the limits of what their white colleagues and interlocutors could handle, especially if those interlocutors didn't know where their own breaking point was. My parents had to know on their behalf. Imagine the black man the white man wants you to be, and be him, or at least mime him. David Marriott writes in his treatise on lynching, our unconscious is given over to what work of second guessing of dare and double dare. There's no place here for what the black man wants or for a black unconscious driven by its own desire and aggression. I watched the world put my parents' desire on lockdown while I marveled at my grandmother and her jailbreak conversation. Black desire is a runaway crime. America no longer needed grandmother for nurturing, for confirmation, for a woman to blame as the nation splits at its seams. The way it still needed my mother. I am a marked woman, Hortense Spillers writes, but not everybody knows my name. Peaches and brown sugar, sapphire and earth mother, auntie, granny, God's holy fool, or a Miss Ebony First, a black woman at the podium. I describe a locus of confounded identities, a meeting ground of investments and privations in the national treasury of rhetorical wealth. My country needs me, and if I were not here, I would have to be invented. America was finished with my grandmother's as its invention. She was free to kick back and kill them, if only in her dreams, or with me when we watched the riots in 1968. But America was not finished with my mother, a 36-year-old black woman in her prime. Just 3 years earlier, in 1965, Daniel Moynihan had named the imago of my mother as the source of destructive vein in ghetto culture and in the black family. She didn't enter a room as a woman with a PhD. She She entered as the foremost reason men feel castrated, as a drag greater than anti-Blackness on the black man's dream of a far horizon. My outburst of joy at the sight of a looter would only confirm what the world already knew about her. For Moynihan, I was a monster of my mother's making. Very, very powerful text right here. Very, very powerful. Breaking down a lot of stuff here, more than I could ever say in just a reaction. But all I have to say is like, wow, just wow at all of this. Oh man, I could just say for that part, survival as a black person, in this world means knowing how to move in a room full of vultures, as Jay-Z said, being able to shapeshift, transform, be a chameleon, basically being able to speak white enough, live white enough, and act white enough just to get by and also maintain your humanity. It's insanity as well. It's very it's a tricky dance. I've definitely had those times where I bit my tongue as a black person, being in rooms full of white people, and yeah, definitely dealing with my bosses as well. But my face, I can't hide it. Like I said at the beginning of the screen, I know people look at me and they hear the words that are coming out of my mouth, but then also look at my face and say, they assume, oh, that guy must really hate white people. And I don't hate white people at all. But yeah, it's I hate whiteness. Whiteness is really bad. White supremacy is very bad. White people, no, people are people, right? People racialized as white, that's a bad thing. And but yeah, that's the thing. Like there's so much to say about this paragraph. It's got my mind going. I really love this book so far, and we're only in chapter 2. It's a very good book. Very good book. So we went to Seattle that summer, a summer sabbatical for my father, a summer of research for my mother. Not a day went by when I wasn't surly. When a bishop came to catechism class on a cool Wednesday evening and asked the scrum of 12 and 13-year-old girls and boys to part that week with their allowance and donate to his mission in Africa, I raised my hand. As in my catechism classes in Minneapolis, I was the only black face in the room. Sister Mary Alvin beamed. The bishop nodded with pious encouragement, a nod I knew well from 6 years in an all-white grammar school back home in Minneapolis. Look, the Negro boy is going to speak. See how politely he raised his hand? Did the Africans ask you to come over? I blurted. The bishop looked at Sister Mary Alvin, then the bishop looked at me. The Holy Spirit needs no invitation. 1 month they wanted him there. News of this reached home before I did, where a spanking was waiting for me. Oh, this is hilarious. See, black parents, don't spank your kids for speaking up to white folks in authority. I repeat, this is bad parenting. They did some good parenting earlier when he hit little Jimmy in the back of the head, little Elgin, whatever, and he started bleeding accidentally. They didn't spank him for hurting white folks, but for hurt white people's feelings. This is a terrible message to send our kids. I'm going to keep on finger wagging. You might not like the finger, but no, don't do that. I'm not a parent, but but if you speak to the pastor and say, hey, maybe you should ask the Africans before you go there and do some neo-colonialism missionary work there, that's okay. Come on now. Anyway, I'm continuing. It became apparent to all that I excelled in sports, and my parents must have thought that the sheer exertion of football and baseball would sweat the surliness from my pores. On her way to the University of Washington, Mom would drop me off at a community center. It was more of a boys' club. I don't recall my younger sister going with me, nor do I see any girls in my mind's eye when those days return to memory. I can only surmise that she and my father thought that it would do me good to be around what I had never been around in my neighborhood. A group of black men, boys really, but unless you were in love with your dentist, you wouldn't call them boys. I don't get that. Boys really, but unless you were in love with your dentist, you wouldn't call them boys. I don't get that. It was here that I came close to what I had only seen on television with my grandmother. Not only did I come to understand that surly was not a personality deficiency of mine and mine alone, but was instead a communal inheritance, as was rage and strong laughter at all the things that made most white people sad. But I also learned about the Black Panthers at this boys' club. I heard the full throttle speech of thoughts I had harbored as wishes without words, such as "I'm 3 seconds off a honky's ass." No, we gotta bring back that 1970s slang, honky, peckerwood. I'm 3 seconds off a honky's ass. That's hard. That's hard. We bringing that back in 2024, maybe. That's what we doing. Anyway, the first time I heard those words spoken at the community center in Seattle, I laughed out loud. How could one word bring so much joy? Honky, it tickled me for days. I'm 3 seconds off that honky's ass. I knew that my parents would be tickled if they heard it from my lips. That I'm 3 seconds off that honky's ass wasn't what they had in mind when they decided Seattle would be the place where I'd meet young black men as role models. I was clever enough to know that that phrase could land me at a white community center for the rest of our summer in Seattle, but I couldn't help myself. Not since my grandmother's "Go ahead, son," had I been so inspired by words. To the far corner of our backyard, I would just go to hear all the different ways I could make those words sing. I'd sing them deep and mellow, and Barry White's baritone voice. I'd sing them like Aretha insisting on RESPECT. I'd sing them falsetto like Eddie Kendrick breaking glass with his voice. Alone in the backyard, I'd go toe to toe with a honky tree, let it know, big don't mean bad. I'm 3 seconds off your honky tree ass. I love this. I love this. We're bringing back this slang, man. 1970s is back, man. If I had hair, we'd grow the afros out. Anyway, uh, mom came to the back porch. I don't know how long she had been standing there. All she heard was the sound of my laughter. All she saw was that I was talking to a tree. In her mental health voice, she asked if I was all right. "Oh yeah, copacetic," I said. "About to beat the bark off this here honky tree, that's all." um, and I would have to hold my gut to keep it from busting open. "Glad to see you smiling, son," she would call out to me before going back inside. There was one honky that wasn't a tree. He ran the principally black community center in Seattle. His name was Reg. He was seldom called him, but we seldom called him by his name, except to his face, which made perfect sense because we weren't talking to his name. Reg had the ambience of a large but fit and bearded cop I saw on several occasions when I later lived in South Africa. A man who went to black watering holes called she beans in Soweto and bought the Africans beer. He had tortured some of them and, when it was over, made them turn the meat on the barbecue grill. He would sit down at the picnic table with them to show them that there was nothing personal in the way he had tortured them. Reg thrust his chin out when he spoke, either to praise the younger boys like me or caution the older ones. Whether in motion or at rest, he fired short, instinctive breaths between his words. He hastened from the playground through the parking lot and gym with the sang-froid of a man who rules. A dust-up went down in the parking lot under a rainless sky. I was inside the community center playing dodgeball when someone yelled, "The shit is on." What was the shit and why was it on? Everyone who raced for the door seemed to know. I was the only one who had no clue. I knew, everyone knew, the hazy contours of why it had happened. The whole world of the center revolved around Reg's rules. Reg decided who could have the basketballs and who couldn't. Reg chose the activities for the week. Reg put a demerit by your name in his book if you cracked out of turn or just spoke too loud. 3 demerits and you couldn't come back for a week. He'd given Luke, a boy of 17, his 3rd demerit. Reg wanted Luke to step off the property. I knew that much when I rushed outside because they had been inside when Reg gave Luke his 3rd warning. Luke had let Reg lead him to the parking lot, but he had stopped as though he'd changed his mind and turned to go back inside. Reg's hand was at Luke's elbow, steering him away. A crowd began to collect around them. I minnowed my way through the crush of man-childs who wanted Luke to get their licks in for them. "Touch me again," I heard Luke said. Luke and Reg were toe-to-toe. I watched with astonishment as Reg inched closer. Reg was a man of at least 25, and he looked like he lifted weights, whereas Luke had the build of a small forward on a high school basketball team. Reg said, "The rules apply to everyone, even to me." To which Luke said, "Touch me again, all right." Luke slipped his hand into his pocket. Reg's expression indicated that he knew exactly what would happen if Luke's hand reappeared and how much the outcome was desired, not only by Luke, but by all the boys around. And Reg seemed to know that his desperate courage would be devoured if he made one false move. Reg stared at us for a moment, and he came nearer to tears or an apology than I had ever seen him come. I was aware of how short I was compared to the others, most of whom, proper teenagers, were older than me. I had to look up to see who was speaking when someone cussed Reg or told Luke to get busy. Birds strafed the sun like a fist of pepper in the last good eye of God. Luke looked like he was tickling his thigh from inside his pants pocket. Reg's voice was cracking, but he couldn't stop reciting the rules. I heard the click of Luke's switchblade before I saw its straight, stiff gleam. Mom used to joke that in the part of New Orleans where she grew up, you could get stabbed over a peanut butter sandwich. Even though she laughed when she said this, the glint in her eye and my father's, sure enough, convinced me she knew what she was on about. I, however, had never seen a stabbing, blood drawn with singular intent. The blood I drew from Elgar Davenport was a result of the lack of wind and the pull of the earth, not the force of my intentions. The forward intent of Luke's switchblade bore scarce resemblance to a chance parabola of a dish soap bottle that arced and fell and split Elgar's head. That's right. Put your hands on me again. Someone behind me said, bleed his ass. Then someone to my left said, bleed his ass. Then a third someone sang it like a hymn. Bleed his ass. Okay. This is ridiculous. Oh God, this is insane. Reg shook his head, more in prayer. It seemed like defiance. He glanced up, but the clouds had run for cover. I heard a woman's voice. No, no, you don't want to do this. I knew that voice. Sometimes in church, if I closed my eyes, it would thread the rich fabric of Gregorian chants and touch me in my pew. My mother had shoved her way to the front, pushing us all aside like wind in tall grass. You all don't want to do this, she kept repeating. She stood between Reg and Luke, that is to say, between Reg and Luke's blade. Someone in the crowd said, "Who's this lady?" And before I could slink back into the corner, another voice said, "Oh, that's little man's mama." She told Luke to take everyone inside. To my astonishment, he closed his switchblade and obeyed. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she made me wait in the parking lot with the honky while she went inside to speak with Luke. When she came out, she said only one word, "Come." Oh, that's embarrassing. Damn, your mama had you outside with that weak ass white boy that was about to get sliced up. You outside. Damn, that's embarrassing. That's hella embarrassing. All right. She bundled Reg into the front seat of her car. She made me sit in the back. As we drove away, Reg's cheek broke. We dropped him at his house and drove off without my being allowed to sit in the front seat. I'd held her in contempt for the rest of the summer, and I held my father in even more contempt for saying she did the right thing. Now I know she wasn't trying to save Reg so much as she was trying to save us from how short our futures would be if Reg got bled. Like her, we had our whole incarcerated lives ahead of us. Top 10. That's a great ending to chapter 2. What an incredible story. What a wild story. Dog, the 70s were different. The 70s and 80s were a different beast. Man, oh man. Reg, no, okay. They shouldn't have stabbed Reg. Don't kill the little white boy. You know what I mean? Don't kill the white boy. But they could have, if somebody, if Luke socked him, that would have made sense, right? If like Luke socked him, gave him a quick, if they like scuffled in the parking lot, you know what I mean? That would have been okay. But don't bleed, Reg. But mama, why you got to save the white boy? You ain't got to save him. Come on, don't be a mammy now. Anyway, that was a great chapter. Like I said, we're jumping ahead to chapter 3. I'm going to be reading this before we wrap up this live stream. So let's go. Before we do that, I'm going to do a quick water break. My wife made me some tea. So quick tea break right here. Oh, it's still hot. Too hot. Oh, that's good. That's good tea. Let me do a water break instead. Soda water. The best soda water you can get in Hungary is this, Scented Karali. I know Karali means king, because I wrote about on my in my series notes from the undergrad about me discovering what the word Karali meant. I think it means Saint King. Oh yeah, Saint King. Yeah, that's what it means. But we got to learn how Corrali meant the hard way. Ain't that right? Ain't that right? All right. Anyway, I'll sip my tea as we go. Let's jump into chapter 3. Then we're going to be wrapping this up. And yeah, let's continue. Hattie McDaniel is dead. This is a story I've never told before, not to my brother or to my sister, not even to the women I've partnered with and married. Nearly 40 years came and went before I could bring myself to say what happened to Stella, her daughter Malika, and me. To go into it, I've always thought would only cause embarrassment for me, a sudden need to be elsewhere, which is the natural response to a confession. Even now, I'll admit it, the story makes me squirm, living with the shame of wanting out when I thought I could die. For years, I've had to live with it, feeling this shame, trying to push it away. There have been times when I've tried to write about it in hopes that through this act of remembrance, putting events down on paper, I could relive the pressure on my conscience. Courage, I seem to think, comes to revolutionaries in finite quantities, like an inheritance that you stash away. Let it earn interest and draw down on when the day of reckoning arrives. It was a comforting theory. It offered hope and grace to a fool. I believed that when it was time for the get down, I would face the man like a BLA soldier, like BLA soldier Asada Shakur faced the man on the New Jersey Turnpike when the state troopers shot her in the chest, that I would get busy like Jonathan P. Jackson got busy in the courthouse in Marion County, California. If the stakes ever became high enough, if the revolution required my sacrifice, I would simply tap a secret reservoir of courage that had been accumulating inside of me from the age of 12, when I read Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, and when my junior high and high school teachers were the doppelgangers of the defendants in the political trials, like the Chicago 8 and the Panther 21. Stella happened to be one of those doubles. We were together almost 10 years, though we never married. She was 38 when we met. I was 22. Interesting. Very interesting. I'm going to read the notes here, but also going to read the comments. Hold on. Said my mic sounds weird. Okay. Check me out. Check me out. Let me know if it sounds good right now. Let me know if it sounds good. Check. You got to let me know. I won't continue reading until then. Let me know if it sounds good before I continue. It's better. Okay, check. 1, 2. It's better, but what? All right, what now? Does it sound good now? You have to let me know. All right, sounds like there's a disconnect. Plug it back in. All right, what about now? Does it sound good now? You have to let me know before I continue. Come on, don't hold it up. I'm trying to finish this chapter. Got other stuff to do today. It's the same. I don't know what the same means. By same, do you mean that it sounds bad or that it sounds good? Maybe take it off. Let me plug it off. All right. What about now? Does it sound? What about now? Does it sound better now? I plugged it up and plugged it back in. Let me check. Check 1, check 2. Check 1, check 2. Check 1, check 2. Yeah, what? What does yeah mean? Yeah, what? Does it sound good or bad? It's better. Okay, thank you. All right. Anyway, continuing here. Let's read the notes. So, Asada Shakur is a Black Liberation Army member. The BLA liberated from prison in 1979. She was granted political asylum in Cuba. Since her escape, Shakur's life has been depicted in songs, documentaries, and various literary works. I really want to read Asada's book. Chicago 8 anti-Vietnam War activists charged with conspiracy to cross state lines to incite violent demonstrations at the August 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Panther 21, the 21 members of the Harlem chapter of the Black Panther Party were charged with 156 counts of conspiracy to blow up subway and police stations, 5 local department stores, 6 railroads, and the Bronx-based New York Botanical Gardens. On May 12, 1971, they were acquitted on all 156 charges. That's where Afeni Shakur was. And Afeni Shakur defended them in court, and she wasn't a lawyer, showing what are the Black women are just undefeatable, undefeatable, indefatigable. I love that word, but I can't pronounce it. But you get what I'm saying. Yeah. Shout out to Afeni Shakur. Shout out to Tupac Shakur. Shout out to Asada Shakur. That family alone is royalty. That family alone, the Shakur family alone, is royalty to us. Come on now. Asada, Afeni, Pac, Matulu. Come on now. Come on now. They got Geronimo Pratt in the extended. You get what I'm saying? Like, God damn. What a family. What a family. One could only hope to have a lineage like that. One could only hope to have a lineage like the Shakurs. God damn. Anyway, I thought it all started when I met Stella at the end of March 1978, just a week after Dartmouth College sent me home for leading Black students in a campaign in solidarity with the people who made the food and cleaned the toilets and lived outside of town. Apparently, some frat boys had complained to the administration that the people from the Appalachian Trail had facial and other deformities brought on by what some Dartmouth fraternity brothers called hillbilly inbreeding. Seeing those people from the Appalachian Trail eating in the same room with them gave them indigestion, the letter claimed. The administration responded by ruling that the service workers in Thayer Dining Hall and the buildings and grounds workers must, from that moment on, eat during off-peak hours and only in antechambers of the dining room that would be set aside for them and them alone. I lobbied the nearly 300 Black students on campus. This was a fascist decree, I argued, and we had to take action. But many others pointed out that the workers who came from nearby backwater towns like Lebanon, New Hampshire, and many two-store and one-saloon towns skirting the mountains flew the Confederate flags in some of the bars and yelled "nigger" with speeding pickups when they drove past us. Once they were three of us lost in the countryside in a time when not even Dick Tracy had GPS. We drove past low-roofed houses, ranged along a forest road like matchsticks spilled on the floor. Every fourth or fifth car was a rusted carcass with cinder block wheels. I was startled by the lack of hatred in the eyes of the children who stared at us when we drove by. When I turned in my seat and looked back at them, they were still staring, as though waiting for God to help them name what they had seen. In the end, the Afro-American Society voted to launch a civil disobedience campaign aimed at forcing the administration to rescind this decree. During the campaign, I was arrested and jailed. A dean waited for me outside the Hanover, New Hampshire courthouse. He handed me a 2-page, single-spaced charge sheet. I told him that the town had dropped all charges. He implored me to read the letter. Your troubles with the town have just ended, but your troubles with Dartmouth College have just begun. 2 years prior, the FBI had tracked me to Trinidad. Like most intelligence files, by the time they are declassified, mine is riddled with redactions like sprigs of buckshot etched on it. In the winter of 1976, the winter of my sophomore year at Dartmouth College, has been redacted. Nor did he or she seem interested in what the not quite 20-year-old young man he or she shadowed was studying. At the University of the West Indies, he studied Caribbean theater. He did field research on Rata, a major family of Loa spirits in Trinidad's incarnation of the West African religion Fudan. His third course was an independent study he designed himself, a 50-page thesis paper he wrote on his experience as a participant researcher in the Communist Party in Trinidad. The FBI file referenced none of this. During his stay in Trinidad, Wilderson was in contact with a member of the Trinidad and Tobago Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, and he promised that individual he would attempt to make contact in the United States for that organization to obtain literature for it and to attempt to procure financial aid. Wilderson allegedly claimed to be a member of an unspecified revolutionary group in the United States. He was born on April 11th, 1956 in the United States, is a student at Dartmouth College, possesses U.S. passport number this, and his mailing address is this. This report was sent from Legat Caracas, the legal attaché in Venezuela, to Clarence M. Kelly, Hoover's successor as director of the FBI. According to official propaganda, the FBI legal attaché works with the law enforcement and security agencies in their host country to coordinate investigations of interest to both countries. The role of legal attaches is primarily one of coordination, as they do not conduct foreign intelligence gathering or counterintelligence investigations. No explanation is given as to why the legat for the FBI in Venezuela was running an asset in Trinidad to spy on an American student, or what the nature of the joint operation between the U.S. and the host country, Trinidad or Venezuela, might be. The report begins. The confidential source abroad mentioned in the memorandum is the redaction is nearly 2 lines long. In other words, more than a name is being withheld. It continues, blank requested to be informed if Wilderson has come to the attention in the past for political extremist activities in the United States. Then the Bureau and the Boston office are requested to advise if Wilderson has come to prior attention in connection with security activities. This, however, is not the story I had never been able to tell. That story I'm going to tell you now, but this FBI report complicates that story. It corrupts the causal links that had helped me make sense of the violence that Stella and I were subjected to 4 years after I returned from Trinidad, 2 years after Dartmouth College had kicked me out for leading a civil disobedience campaign on behalf of workers who were white, and to our black and lonely student minds, unrepentant racists. The FBI file came in the middle of writing this chapter. It corrupted the causal logic of the events that make my hand quiver as I scratch these words with my pen. Before the file arrived, I thought that at last I can chart a point-to-point pilgrim's progress of the chain of events that drove Stella and me and Malika, her young daughter, from our homes. Events that left us no alternative but to send Malika away to live with her relatives for her own safety. Events that drove Stella and me from the state of Minnesota when we ran out of friends and sanctuaries. The FBI file came when I finally steadfast in my conviction that what happened to us had to do with Stella's past, not hers and mine. I even blamed the break-in at my studio apartment by 2 white men who wanted nothing of value as collateral heat from Stella's lawsuit against the government. So, part 2. It's a month before I turn 24, and I've stolen my parents' car. They're in Moscow, mom and dad, or Peking, or maybe they're in Bremen or Belize. A 2-month tour studying the pitfalls of Soviet mental health clinics, 3 weeks of consulting with Chinese special education administrators, a Ford Foundation study of German urban renewal, or a rescue mission for American students who smoked too much dope and were bounced into jail in Belize. I don't know because I don't live with them anymore. My 14-year-old brother gave me the details, but all that registered was the fact that their car was in the garage. 2 years prior, in March 1978, I was, as mentioned, kicked out of Dartmouth College for leading an act of civil disobedience. It was the end of winter quarter in my senior year, and I was 3 classes shy of my degree. To Stella and whoever else asked, I wore indefinite suspension from Dartmouth College like a combat medal. But no one knows how much I cried on that Greyhound back to Minneapolis. Before I left the room of the tribunal with my pink slip giving me 48 hours to pack my dorm room and leave Hanover, the chair of the committee, a dean, acknowledged that the punishment was harsh, but he explained a team of psychologists had been evaluating me since I had arrived at Dartmouth. I'd had 4 years, these phantoms of therapy, whom I had never met, concluded to inculcate the esprit de corps of an Ivy League institution. The dean's exact words and the words, no doubt, of the psychologists. For 4 years, I'd been under psychiatric care without ever meeting my caregivers. In this, they were one with the FBI asset who tracked me to Trinidad and reported to Boston and Caracas all day, all night, angels watching over me. So, Acti said, his parents are so cool. I hope I can do what they are doing as psychologists. Yeah, it's a cool life bouncing around the globe, but the down part is you got to be a psychologist. I'm joking. All right. Kicked out of college. Poor Frank. Part 3. Stella had changed from the woman she was 9 years prior. When I saw her at the Armory on the University of Minnesota's campus, I was almost 15. She had been 31 for 3 months. It was March 1971, the same month and year as the break-in at the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, that would soon blow the lid off COINTELPRO. On that morning, William Cawley was convicted for the massacre of nearly 500 Vietnamese civilians by Company C in a village called My Lai. The massacre was in the forefront of Stella's mind as she stood by a bus and told anxious inductees they'd returned from Vietnam wearing the tucked sleeve of a one-armed boy. Richard Nixon took reassuringly to the airwaves. American troops are now in a defensive position. The offensive activities of search and destroy are now being undertaken by the South Vietnamese. The bombing of Cambodia was still underway, and I was a shoplifter in Dinkytown, 2 blocks away from the campus of the University of Minnesota. The cold front had quickly crumbled and temperatures rose from the 50s to as high as 70 degrees. There was no ice or slush on the sidewalks. My friend Robert Stevenson Stone and I boosted rock albums and sold them to the hippies at cut rate prices. With the pavements dry, we would outrun any cashier in Dinkytown. The E Pluribus Funk albums by Grand Funk Railroad, I recall, were completely round and covered with a silver-like film to resemble a large coin. The backside of the cover of this album included a picture of Shea Stadium to celebrate Grand Funk Railroad beating the Beatles' Shea Stadium attendance record by selling out in just 72 hours. I stole 3 of them from a record store in Dinkytown near a coffee shop where Bob Dylan used to play. Dinkytown was not a town or even a neighborhood, but simply 2 blocks of shops and eateries at the edge of the University of Minnesota. Our high school consisted of 2 buildings, one at each end of Dinkytown. Tucked behind the main gates at the university was Pike Hall, which had been the university lab school for the children of professors. At the other end of Dinkytown was an uninspired brick building that had been Marshall Public High School for white working class kids. The 2 schools merged in 1968 in a social experiment financed in large part by funds from LBJ's Great Society initiatives. The children of liberal mandarins were made to mingle with the children of flour mill and railway workers and to give the experiment demographic integrity. Native Americans were bussed in from the south side and blacks were bussed in from the north side to the tune of 4% and 9 or 10% respectively. On my way to the record store where 5-finger discounts awaited, I walked through Dinkytown with my face turned triumphantly up to the first real warmth of sun. Bob Stone was long and lanky, sort of like Al Green on stilts. We had been the same heights when we started the 9th grade, but over the Christmas break, he grew like a plant in time-lapse photography. I was jealous of his height, so I told myself I had something better, a leather jacket with gold bars, and I felt stars for my 3 sports, football, ski jumping, and track and field, none of which Bob participated in because though he could run, he wasn't athletic. I told Bob to boost only E Pluribus Funk's albums. He said we could get more money for some Hendrix LPs. Band of Gypsies won't fit under your shirt, I protested, but Bob wouldn't listen. He damn near got us busted. We always entered the record store separately, and we each had our inherent diversions to offer. The clerk would look up and see my black face. I didn't have to look at them to feel that their eyes narrowed on my face and my hair. A moment later, I could feel their gaze settle serenely on my leather jacket. Sports keep him out of trouble. Bob wasn't so lucky. He lived in the projects and he didn't have a sport, whereas I lived in a mansion and had a sport for each season. So he didn't have a leather jacket, and the windbreaker his mother had not replaced since 7th grade looked like a nylon t-shirt. We went in first. He went in first. I normally came in second. From the window on the street, I watched the clerk watch Bob's every move. When I arrived, he focused on me. In the interstice of time, when he would decide if I was a good black or just a black, Bob would make his play and slip an album or 2 under his windbreaker. I first saw Stella the same day Bob went off script and switched from Grand Funk Railroad to Jimi Hendrix. That's the way to do it. Now, stealing is not okay, but we all know that crime is just class warfare by a different name, right? Like, class warfare by a different name is crime to some degree. And people stealing is just what it is, right? When we don't have access to money, we will get things by any means necessary. But if you're going to steal, you have to have a plan. And if you're not doing your crimes alone, you got to have a diverse group of people. So if I were to be a shoplifter, and I'm not encouraging shoplifting or crime at all, but if I were to be a thief or a criminal, I would get the whitest white boy that you have ever seen, or the whitest white woman you have ever seen, to be my partner in crime. I walk into the store. Of course, I'm being followed around. Meanwhile, that white girl or white boy is just stuffing everything in the purse, everything in the fucking purse. That would be absolutely great. That's what I'm gonna do. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put out the job notice for anybody that wants to be my partner in crime and just ransacking everything. Continuing here. We'd been in the store 5 or 6 minutes. The clerk went back to reading Ramparts, that countercultural left-wing magazine of the period, and looking up once or twice to watch Bob, who had his back to him as he fingered a crate of albums at the far end of the store. I had 3 E Pluribus Funk albums lined against my ribs and still had room for 2 more. I walked to the counter to buy some zigzag rolling papers, hoping Bob could scram while I paid. But the dude at the till was a stacker. Was a task stacker. He counted my change with one eye and peered over my shoulder with the other. It would have been a groove if not for the pointed breast Bob had poking through his windbreaker. Breasts he didn't have when he came in. Watch the counter, the man told me as he chased Bob out of the store and down the block in the direction of campus. The long, flaxen hair cashier came back winded and sweaty, his cheeks the color of flamingos. You know him? I shook my head. Boosting ain't a hip thing, my brother. We're one tribe, man, the clerk said to me, and he thanked me for watching the cash register. That's funny. That's funny. Ackley says, well, now we know what we will do when we're broke. When we're broke. We are broke. We are broke right now. We are broke right now, sis. Anyway, continuing here. Bob and I met 6 blocks away at the ROTC Armory on campus, a sandy brick fortress with ramparts at each end like rooks on a chessboard. 3 chartered buses faced southeast on University Avenue in front of the Armory. 5 white men and 3 white women sat in the street, their backs to the bumper of the lead bus. Or the lead bus. They smoked cigarettes. They held 2 fingers up in the air. A crowd gathered along the sides of the buses. Bob said we should offload our gear before the pigs came and vamped. Get they cash, man, before they get their heads busted. Carbon monoxide puttered from the quiet tailpipe of one idling bus. A line of inductees filed down the steps of the Armory, and the crowd of protesters began to chant beneath the salmon-colored sky. She was hard to miss, Stella. There weren't many black men among the protesters, and she was the only black woman. She was in front and down the steps close to the buses. The draftees were all down the stairs now. Bob and I climbed the stairs and looked down. It was a perfect place to be in case 5-0 vamped with their nightsticks. They would bust the protesters' heads by the buses, not ours, as long as we stood on higher ground. Hell no, we won't go. We won't fight for Texaco, yelled the crowd. Not Stella. She spoke to each inductee individually as they got on the bus. She asked them if they had loved ones she could contact if they died. She told another one, the people you kill over there will always be in your head. An easy wind rustled the trees. A pair of large Bose 901 speakers in the window of the frat house across the street was playing The Weight, Take a Load Off Fanny. The lead singer's voice was high as a lusty wildcat, as stern as a southern preacher, as depleted as a rebel soldier going back to Turkey Scratch, Arkansas, a dirt farmer at the end of his day. The music kite whistled over the crowd of protesters and the line of young vacant faces filing onto the buses. Stella thrust a life photograph of Lieutenant Cowley up to them as they passed her. I thought she was bulletproof. You're better than this, she told them. A sergeant snatched the photograph from Stella. He tore it to shreds. Tell them, she said, pointing to the men looking out the window. Turn around and tell them they'll come back with their sanity, as well as their arms and legs. Bob stood next to me on the top step of the Armory. He noticed how I marveled at her. That's too much woman for you, Bob said. The hell you say? And look how she's performing for these hippies. They aren't hippies. They're SDS. Look, man, a couple of our teachers are here. Our school was a lab school. One building was on campus and the other building was on the other side of Dinkytown. Some of our teachers were graduate students going for their PhDs in education. The New Left and the hippies are on different tips. Do you actually read the Ramparts magazines I give you? They're all the whites unwashed to me, and she's playing to them. I slipped the 3 albums out from under my jacket and said, we're playing to the white unwashed, aren't we? We're getting paid. She's getting used. The war is not a race issue. It's a class issue. It affects us all. I'm just saying, I know her type. What type is that? The type who into white boys. Not like it matters to you the way you came up. How did I come up? Forget it, Frank. No, tell me. And which is it? She's too much woman for me, or we're both the same kind of Oreo. Go for what you know, Frank. She could blurp you. She could burp you at night before you go to sleep. Wow. As it happened, Stella, during my high school and college years, worked as a nurse until she broke her back. It never healed well enough for her to go back to nursing. So she went to work as an administrator in the College of Education, where my father was a dean during the Vietnam War. She managed the placement and affairs of graduate students who worked as teachers at the experimental lab high school that Bob and I attended on campus. But in 1978, when we became lovers, she worked as an aide for elementary school teachers and collected welfare to cover the gap. After the first meeting, or rather sighting, at the Armory, 7 years would pass until we met again. And the 7 years from the age of 15 to the age of 22 were longer in my mind than the 7 years she traveled from 31 to 38, which is to say less time, and fewer memories had passed in those 7 years for Stella than they had for me. I had gone from ninth grade to the end of my senior year in college. Unlike me, she grew but did not grow up in those years. So when she saw me again at a branch of the library near her house in faded khaki pants tucked into fry boots, an army surplus trench coat draped across the chair, I wasn't using and my hair cornrowed in neat lines along my scalp, she recognized me immediately. But I didn't know where I'd seen this beautiful woman with her wide-eyed daughter before. The next day, I hitchhiked from Minneapolis to Columbus, Ohio. After a month, I came back to Minneapolis and looked her up. By the end of the summer, we were in love. All right, chasing MILFs. MILF chasing. Okay, what a life. What a life. See, once again, this is one of those experiences I can't relate to. I'll never forget. One time, my mother told me when I was about 17 or 18 or something like that, I got like a job in the summer before I went to college. And my mom told me if any older women try to like talk to you or say that you're so handsome or try to rub on your body, stuff like that, don't let them and tell me. Because like, that's what happens a lot in America, unfortunately. Of course, we've all heard the stories about like young guys in high school getting sexually assaulted, molested by their teachers, raped by their female teachers. Never happened to me. Never happened to me. I was 17, 18, 19, 20, prime years of my life, never got molested. I never got molested. I should be happy. I should be happy, but I'm also depressed. That shows me I've been ugly for a long time. I'm ugly gang. I've been ugly gang. I've been ugly gang outside. Never had older women try to suck on me when I was a kid. Never had older women try to like rub on me when I was a kid. Thank God, because I could be messed up in the head. I think that's how a lot of male porn stars start. Like they get raped by like their aunties or older cousins, and then they say, "Well, I guess I'll just throw dick on OnlyFans now." So, anyway, I'm glad that didn't happen to me. But Frank, you out here chasing MILFs, and the MILF actually wanted to throw it at you? Frank. Couldn't be me. When I was that age, we were just catching what we could catch. And a lot of it was around our age. Never too younger. Like exactly around that age. You get what I'm saying? I was getting busy, but I wasn't messing with a 31 or 38-year-old woman with kids at that age. You know what I'm saying? That's wild. That to me just automatically is like unattractive. I know there are people that are into MILFs, into moms and stuff like that. You get what I'm saying? But when you're that age, you don't want that for me. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. That's wild. Anyway, we baked souffles in her large cast iron skillet in the evening after supper when her daughter Malika went to bed. We would sit on her front porch and watch the sun redden, and I would read to her from a novel I was writing, or she'd teach me how to listen to Miles. The long pauses between notes, Stella said, just under the music. Miles made silence part of his music, small clusters of intention without sound. She said, she made me feel comfortable enough to read my fledgling prose to her. She closed her eyes as she listened. So much woe in your voice, she said. You're the prince of darkness. You were born on a Wednesday, am I right? Two bolts of silver gray etched themselves on the front of her natural hair like low sparks of lightning rising above her eyes. Heads turned to watch her when she entered the room, and I felt a surge of manhood when they looked from her to me. That's right, people. She's with me. At a distance, folk on campus would take her for Angela Davis, and I was honored as if through osmosis. But even when the mirage had melted, they drank of her singular beauty. For even in leather sandals, she was tall for a woman. She didn't powder her face or rouge her lips. She owed her flawless skin to the fact that she ate organically long before it was the fashion, and that she had no tuck. She had no tuck with sugar. She had no truck with sugar. I've never heard these phrases. When I first saw those two lightning bolts in her hair, I thought she could take down the world. Some folks called her a troublemaker. I saw a black woman who stood up for herself and anyone else who was being abused. When she sat in her porch chair and watched people come and go across the courtyard of the apartment complex where she lived, Stella smoked a corncob pipe without ever lighting it, as my father had done when I was a kid. And it looked just like the one I saw my great grandmother smoke when I was 12 years old, the one and only time I saw her. In fact, Stella had the same cleft on the bridge of her nose that I see on Grandma Harper when I conjure her. It chiseled both women's gaze. Stella would bring her flute to hear Frank West play long after he left Count Basie's band. The club was small and half the people weren't listening to the music. So when the band took a break, Stella took me to the stage and introduced me to him. Then she took out her flute and West improvised with her for a moment or two. No way in hell was I going back to Dartmouth. She saw how depressed I was about being kicked out of school. The stronger my putative pose of indifference, the more seismic my mood swings. I could be in a room with Malika and Stella, and I might not say a word for 5 minutes, though words roiled in my head, loud as foghorns. Not only had Stella been a nurse, but she was an autodidact nutritionist. She was the first person to tell me how cancer might be cured by diet, something I learned years later was called the Gerson method. She and Malika rarely ate meat and very little poultry. I can't remember one fried meal in places like McDonald's, White Castle, and Burger King, where I had worked in Dinkytown when I first laid eyes on Stella, were off limits. I ate a fair amount of chocolate bars in 1978 when we first got together. She made me uncomfortable the way she watched me and said, "It's your funeral," with the shrug of her shoulders. Okay, so he got some Erica Badu pussy. This is what this is. He's on one hand infatuated by this probably very fine ass woman because he's describing her like she's like, Foxy Brown or something like that. So she's very fine, but she's also Earth Mama. She's also Erica Badu. She's also didn't you know? Didn't you know? Yeah, that's what this is. So this this earthy hippie Badu, he's under the spell of Baduism. Now I get it. Now I get it. I've never had one of those. I'm gonna keep it a buck. When I think back on my life, my slanging career before I retired, I never had an Earth Mama. I never had an Erica Badu. I never had one of those that turn you out and saying, "Yeah, man, meat will have you, getting eye cancer." Like I never had one of those. I've known people like that, but I never had a woman like that in my life. C'est la vie. C'est la vie. All right. Continuing here. She said, "Eating chocolate will be your funeral," with a shrug on her shoulders. When I finally moved in with her, she would snatch a Snickers bar out of my hand with, "Let's see what those criminals are poisoning you with," turning a 3-syllable word into 2. Then, as I looked on with forlorn loss, Stella would read aloud all the unpronounceable chemicals put in by the Mars Incorporated, a corporation that I, even as a young communist, saw as my friend who just wanted me to enjoy a scrumptious nougat topped with caramel and peanuts and robed in a mouth-watering milk chocolate. I had never thought to read the ingredients, nor would I have thought they were poison. But Stella insisted that the high fructose corn syrup and the artificial flavoring were major contributors to my mood swings and depression. On New Year's Day, 1979, she made a deal with me. Give up my Mars bars, my Snickers bars, my Three Musketeers for 6 weeks. She also wanted me to be a label sleuth with her in the store, by which she meant she would read the labels of everything we considered purchasing, from cereal to ketchup, and discard the products with more than 7 grams of processed sugar or any amount of high fructose corn syrup. If, after 6 weeks, I did not feel the fog lift from my brain, if the mood swings continued as before, then I could go back to my old reckless ways. Needless to say, Stella's wager worked. I had the kind of clarity of mind that I had not known in my 2 decades and change on the planet. I often wonder how I might have weathered the storm at Kenwood Elementary School had I known about sugar when I was a child. It wasn't just abstinence she wanted from me. Over those 6 weeks, we read William Duffy's Sugar Blues, a book that argues that sugar was once the cocaine of the Western world and is still as debilitating and addictive as nicotine. In winter, we made stovetop coffee in a saucepan of water and 4 tablespoons of fine ground coffee floating on the surface. If we got to talking at the table and not paying attention, we would almost let it boil. It had to only almost boil for its rich roasted taste to keep from turning bitter. The year I made up my mind that I was never going back to Dartmouth, we lived 5 blocks from the campus. The war in Vietnam had ended 3 years before, and the campus didn't look anything like the place I knew in high school. When Saigon fell in 1975, the atmosphere thinned of the righteous indignation that had thickened the air. It made me melancholy and made Stella sort of a has-been. Gone were the incandescent barricades severing the university's Washington Avenue artery to downtown Minneapolis. Gone were the voices with their list of demands from the occupied windows of Morrill Hall. Gone were the lectures that were thrown out the window when classes and seminars were commandeered for anti-imperialist teach-ins. All that was a brief moment when the world was being remade, and Stella could arrive unannounced, and she could rise and be applauded before she even spoke. But that moment was no more. The white left had robbed her while licking her face. 1, 2, 3, mini Vietnam, she said with a laugh. It wasn't about Vietnam. It was about the shit they hadn't worked out at home. Now they want to go home. That's why you can. That's what you can do if you're white in this country. You can be a tourist in your own movie. Stella wasn't wrong. Whether underground fugitives were even turning themselves into the police and doing unheard of deals with prosecutors, while members of the Black Liberation Army were still being hunted and tortured if and when they were captured. At one sleepy New York precinct, whether underground fugitives made the inconvenient error of trying to surrender in the afternoon on a Friday, they were told to come back on Monday and turn themselves in. Imagine, Stella said, if that was you and me turning ourselves in. Friday be damned. They would stay late, not to book us, but to beat us, and be so deep in their pleasure when they got done that they forget to put in for the overtime. Wow. One night in bed, I said that the 2 streaks of silver in her hair were beautiful, but I noted that a woman in her late 30s was too young to have gray hair. Did something happen to you? I asked her. Something traumatic? I wanted her to trust me the way I trusted her. Stress, she said. Then she turned over and went to sleep. Stella turned me on to the works of Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. Together, we discovered Fuentes, Amato, and Garcia Marquez. And though she was almost a generation older and grew up in the South, while I was born in the South but grew up in Minnesota, we shared the same way of being in our bodies, the same tonalities in our voices when we were with our white friends. We both knew how to make them feel at home. Our words were effortless and well chosen. They told us, not in words, how authentic they felt with us, how they were going to take themselves seriously from now on. The jazz was always so soft when they came to our house. With our Black friends, we discussed what worrisome burdens white people can be. But this duality had limits. Making our white friends feel safe in our presence made them think that we were somehow evolved in a way that the Black people they saw burning down the cities in the 1960s were not. From 1978 until we fled our apartment in the spring of 1980, we hauled crates of apples and organic produce with our white friends at the Wedge, the city's first coop, with its unfinished floors and its funky bins of oatmeal, chia seeds, raw almonds, and stone ground millets in the bulk. They felt at home in our house, a sense of welcome they could never feel, even if it was extended to them in the Black neighborhood on the near north side of town. Our dwelling was the ground floor of a duplex in the center of a courtyard and drive that was ringed by a ramshackle horseshoe of wooden townhouse apartments just 5 blocks from campus. There's something about a campus community that makes you feel as though nothing catastrophic can happen to you there, as though the real world begins at the border. No lunch bucket laborers stepping tired off the bus, no deuce and a quarters double parked on the boulevard, no big hats and overcoats slung over one arm in basement nightclubs, no burst of sound in the street that stops the heart. Visiting our home was less strain on their nerve than adding ornaments from far off places to their shelves. And they left with the feeling that they'd marched in Selma and hurled bricks during the riots on the north near side. Basically saying, like, when the white folks come around them, they feel comfortable and basically they feel chill. And once again, that's a superpower. If you know how to master making white people feel comfortable and also how to maintain your blackness, there's unlimited potential for thee. There's unlimited potential for thee in this white supremacist capitalistic world, though it shouldn't be that way, right? We should be able to be our true, authentic selves and embrace our blackness or disregard it entirely. Anyway, but that wasn't enough for Josephine, who worked with nuclear fusion and nuclear waste in a lab at the university. I've long since forgotten if she was on the faculty or if she worked as a technician. This amnesia has kept me sane for almost 40 years. She lived above us. Before I came on the scene, Josephine and Stella had issues, mainly their disagreements over the ethics and safety of nuclear power. The 3 Mile Island accident had happened on March 28, 1979, less than 6 months after I became a factor in Stella's and, by extension, Josephine's lives. But their heated debates over this issue, and even the way Stella's routine changed when we became lovers, were not the real cause of the meltdown between these two women. Stella was simply tired of playing Hattie McDaniel to Vivian Leigh. I've nursed her through her failed relationships, but she never seemed to care about what I was going through. Josephine seemed to think that the downstairs part of the house was simply an extension of the upstairs part where she lived. It wasn't the unscheduled visits that annoyed Stella and me, but the injury Josephine felt when Stella asked her to knock before coming inside or to call first when Frank is here. When she heard such words, you could set your watch by the sundial on her face: guilt, resentment, aggression. Malika, Stella, and I were in the back of the house eating dinner at the kitchen table. We heard the front door open and close. Josephine appeared in the threshold of the kitchen with bushels of lilacs in a straw basket. She had picked them in the courtyard just for us. No doubt in her mind, the gifts of flowers offset her violation of our space. But looking back on it, all I see is the extension of the master's prerogative in the way Josephine treated Stella. There's a scene in the film 12 Years a Slave in which the master, Edwin Epps, bursts into the slave cabin while they're in bed. He dances in the middle of their sleeping quarters and commands them to rise and make merriment in the big house with him. It has taken me 40 years to understand how neither he nor Josephine have violated anyone's space. The cabin where they slept belonged to him as much as their flesh belonged to him. The regime of violence that made them his property and prosthetics of his desire made it impossible to see what he did as a violation. This is to say that I was wrong to think Josephine did something wrong. At one time in history, Eastern Seaboard slave had grown to believe in the elasticity of accumulation and fungibility. In other words, slaves on the Eastern Seaboard were not Afro-pessimists in that they did not see themselves as primarily the objects of captivity. Rather, they saw themselves as the subjects of hyper-exploitation. And like me and Stella in 1980, slaves of the late 18th and 19th centuries on the Eastern Seaboard might have imagined that their dwellings were also their homes, and not the always and already home of Josephine and her race. They were in for a traumatic awakening when, starting in 1808, the westward movement and plantation culture to Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, whether it was driven by individual owners who accompanied their slaves or by professional slave traders, tore that society asunder, exiling hundreds of thousands from their birthplace and traumatizing those who remained. Families and sometimes whole communities dissolved under the pressure of this second Great Migration. In short, Josephine was libidinally within her rights on the day she barged in while we were eating dinner. With as much poise as she could muster, Stella thanked Josephine and said that the two of them should meet tomorrow for coffee. I thought you said you and Frank were busy tomorrow, Mom. Stella eyed her daughter as if to say, let's not do this now. Josephine was in no mood for discretion. In fact, Stella's poise rankled Josephine more than if she had jumped out of a bag. Why coffee all of a sudden? Josephine said. To talk about boundaries. I thought you were a feminist, she told Stella as she turned to go. For almost 40 years, I've wondered how this scene between Josephine and Stella played out in Malika's 12-year-old mind. We weren't always the best parents, Stella and I. We never took time with Malika after these tense confrontations with someone like Josephine. This isn't entirely true. Stella always explained to her the underlying nature of racism, the monstrous violence ensconced within the mundane of microaggressions. But, and this I regret with all my heart, we never asked her how she processed these spectacles emotionally. We didn't know how she had been wounded, just as I had no idea as a young boy how Mrs. Davenport's words would later affect me. Very important. Once again, I'm not a child psychologist. I'm not a parent at all. Who knows if I'll ever be one? But if you have Black children or children dealing with racism or of any type or any traumatic experience, I think it's very important you talk to your kids, ask them how they're feeling about that situation, try to provide as much context or knowledge that you can to the situation, and just give space to breathe. And unfortunately, I think a lot of traumas in the Black community, especially when it relates to dealing with white supremacy, we don't do that a lot with children. I know some people do. Before you come for me in the comments, but there have been times, like I talk about the story all the time when I got suspended from school for not pledging allegiance to the flag. Nobody asked me why. Nobody asked me why, as in what's my motivation. They just only said you were bad for doing that, and you need to apologize, and you need to be punished for that, which is not cool. Needless to say, the fact that I was only 11 years old than Malika didn't help our relationship. She and I had a hard time adjusting to one another. On more than one occasion, she told me, "You're not my father." As a young girl, she had a lot to contend with. Her biological father was Jewish, and though he seemed to have abandoned her emotionally and financially, and though his family had disowned and disinherited him until he divorced Stella, she carried with her the ensemble of dilemmas that seems to afflict mixed race children into adulthood. A fear of slipping into the darkness of their Black side and without ever having ascended to the light of white redemption. And for my part, I resented the fact that she was born with this crisis and I was not. A crisis in which I, as a dark-skinned person with no whiteness in my features, was a living, breathing image of the hell into which she could descend. There's a lot to break down there. I mean, this is his story. I'm not going to get too deep into that, but I'll just let that sit. I'll let that sit. Continuing here. Stella told me how hard she had worked to teach her daughter about our culture and the lashes we endured for the rights most people don't even know they have. But it's slipping away, she said. Sobbing, the longer I stay here, the more it slips away. As time went on, I saw other things. How her breath quickened as if she'd felt a sudden tightness in her chest when she spoke of urban risers or of LBJ's Great Society programs and the lawsuit she had filed against it. She said she had proof of embezzlement, legal documents, and audio tapes of board meetings that she had recorded herself. You're saying the federal government or someone at HEW knew about all this? I asked her. I meant it as a question. She took it as a challenge. You can ask my lawyer, Noam Davidov, she said, if you don't believe me. You talk like you're used to being doubted. I'm a Black woman. What rock have you been under? Noam Davidov came to the house and said that after years of wrangling with the federal government, he had secured a court date for her, November 13th, 1980. Which at this time was in less than a year. He also had resources to help her. Then he looked my way and said, or you until we go to court. Or you until we go to court. He didn't mean help. He meant to protect. And by resources, he seemed to be referring to protection. It was then that I would understand the gravity of Stella's lawsuit. The board members of urban riders whom she was accusing of graft, and maybe even people in the government who ran interference for them or looked the other way, could not afford for the recordings and documents Stella had amassed to be made public. Noam's hair was curly, like Abby Hoffman's. He was a movement lawyer. It was clear he earned more gratitude than money. With his brown corduroys, his unknotted necktie, and his stone-washed raincoat, home from the wars. By the way, HUE stands for Health, Education, and Welfare. It was a cabinet level department of the United States government from 1953 and until 1979. Who got rid of that? Reagan. Reagan got rid of that. So attorney Mark Lane joined Kunstler's legal team in 1974. I guess that will come up later. Yeah, it's in this paragraph. In the early 1970s, Noam Davidoff worked with the radical lawyer William Kunstler, as well as Mark Lane, and a group of researchers to represent the American Indian movement, defendants in the Wounded Knee trial. I didn't know Stella back then, but Stella and Noam had been lovers, and she attended every session of the trial. At the front door, she straightened the collar of his shabby raincoat, so now a dull metallic jealousy began to gather at the back of my mind. She and Noam shared a history salted with victories, like the verdict in the favor of the Native American defendants Noam had helped to secure. She and I had no history at all, and the history we were making, I feared, a fear that yokes me to this day, was unfolding as a story I would never want to tell. I wish I'd gone to the kitchen or turned my head to cough, to go back in time and orchestrate a random distraction to prevent me from the sight of her fingers straightening his collar. I wanted him to leave, but just as strongly, I wanted him to stay. I believed that he, not I, had the credentials to tell her to take the settlement and not go to trial. As much as my heart pained me to see them speak so effortlessly together, even when they disagreed, as much as I wanted that to be over, it was clear that if anyone could change Stella's mind, it was Noam, not me. He made it plain that the government would settle with Stella out of court. Noam was absolutely sure Stella would get $100,000. She would have to hand over all the tapes of the secret recordings she'd made when she was an employee at Urban Risers. She would have to relinquish financial documents she photocopied to prove corruption and the secret audio recordings she made of Urban Risers meetings that might be incriminating of Kapolei Kenyatta, who had been the director of Urban Risers, or employees of the federal government with whom Kapolei Kenyatta worked. All of this would be sealed. There's one more thing. You'll have to sign a non-disclosure agreement giving your word you won't talk about the case, ever, he emphasized. You talk about this after they pay you, Stella, and they'll come after you. What if I don't settle out of court? What if I don't settle out of court? She said. Then you're done. Then you're down for next November, a week after the presidential election of 1980. As your lawyer, I have to advise you. Stella scoffed. I've warned. I've waited years. I can wait 11 months. Take a few days to think about it. You wouldn't settle if you were in my shoes, would you? You never settled with the government. I was never the litigant, and I'm not a single mom with financial challenges. Just say welfare, Gnome. It's only two syllables. Have you forgotten all the people who were murdered by government proxy during the Wounded Knee affair? Then Gnome turned to me. What do you think? You didn't answer my question, Stella interjected before I could speak. You can start over with that kind of money. He said, still not answering the question. Stella rejoined. A trial could reveal Kapolei Kenyatta's connection to government officials who can't afford to be linked to someone like him. If you make it to the courthouse, if I make it to the courthouse, I watched these two old lovers talk about death as though they were the heroine and hero of a film noir classic, weighing their options against the mob. But as the conversation wound down and Stella had still refused the settlement, I knew it wasn't a film, and I knew that I wasn't a spectator. If I settle out of court, Stella said, as Noam set his teacup down on the living room table and inched forward in the easy chair, I'll never know who was behind all this. If it ever makes it to the newspaper, and you're basically telling me that won't happen because the money buys my silence, based on the evidence so far, they'd call it another example of the kind of gangsterism and shady business dealings people associate with the ghetto in North Minneapolis, but not when they think of 3M Corporation in Maplewood, the regional banks downtown, or the Pillsbury Company's assortment of businesses. The government will get away clean. $100,000 is nothing for them to pay if it means they can avoid indictments up the food chain. Noam stood up and said he understood. Stella had always been a fighter, and he hadn't expected her to take the out-of-court settlement. As I watched them and I listened, I had the feeling of being 11 years old, seated at a folding table with other children at Thanksgiving, catching fragments of what the adults said at the long old wood table in the center of the room. Noam picked up his vintage leather briefcase, scooped the files from the coffee table, and put them up. There's more to this than meets the eye, he said, as he slung his raincoat on. It sloped to one side. A corner of his collar had folded under, and he hadn't noticed. She rose and plucked it free. It was an act of tenderness and joy, and I hope to God, not desire. Oh, Gnome, she chuckled as she patted his lapel with her palm. For the past 90 minutes, I had waited for an intimacy to pass between them. He smiled back. They've done this 100 times before, I thought. I watched her watch him down the stairs. This man was getting cucked in his own house. This man was getting cucked, low key, by the white man. White man coming in, basically, uh, this is her ex. This is her ex. They're flirting in the hallways, and he's like watching in silence in the corner, like a cuck, like Diddy, or like the average white man. The average white man when his wife is with her boyfriend named Tyrone. All right, continuing here. Though I spent nights on end in the lower level of the duplex where Stella lived with Malika, I still had my own apartment when Gnome came to Stella's house. It was November 1979. By the end of the year, I would be on welfare. In fact, it was that November of 1979 that Stella and I saw our revolution die. It was the month we rejoiced at the news that Assata Shakur had been freed from a maximum security prison by the Black Liberation Army. It was the month the Ku Klux Klan shot and killed black demonstrators in Greensboro, North Carolina. Just rode up to the picket line, got out of the car, and shot them at near point blank range. November was the month we watched it on the news. The Klansmen opened their trunk. They fetched their weapons. They sprinted 10 yards to the marchers. They opened fire. 5 lay dead on the ground. That month, Stella and I had no idea that Assata would have to spend the rest of her life in Cuba in exile. We had no idea that the film we saw would not be enough to convict the assailants. And we had no idea that by March of the coming year, we'd be sleeping in my parents' car. Several days after Gnome left, days crowded with silence as Stella thought on what he had said. She called a man named Jamal. She told him she needed protection. There was silence on his end for 3 interminable beats. Protection from who? Jamal asked her. The system, she said. By the end of 1979, the number of people Stella knew who could hear the system without raising an eyebrow had dwindled. But Jamal used to say, just because you're not paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. In 1968, when he and Stella and damn near everyone they knew believed in revolution, Jamal had gone up against the system and did a nickel of a 10-year stint in the Stillwater prison in Bayport, Minnesota. He wasn't someone who would raise an eyebrow when someone mentioned the system. As a result of Stella's call, Jamal and a brilliantly taciturn brother dropped by Stella's house one night when I wasn't there. Jamal said, "Let's go for hamburgers." As we mentioned to the ceiling lights and the telephone, then he put his fingers over his lips. Stella thought of the White Castle as a temple where Satan killed you with sodium and trans fat. But this wasn't a night for insisting that Jamal sit down with her and pour over back issues of Prevention magazine. In the booth at the White Castle restaurant on 36th Avenue and East Lake Street, Stella's daughter, who never missed anything, watched as the quiet brother looked around the restaurant, then nodded to Jamal. Malika saw Jamal unwrap his hamburger and put it on his lap. Then he fetched something from his pocket and wrapped it in the hamburger paper, which he passed to Stella. Later that night, Malika told me that she got up to go to the bathroom and found her mother sitting on the bed with an automatic handgun and a magazine of bullets. She watched her mother snap the clip into place, wrap it in an oilskin, and hide it in the closet, deep behind the shoes. I was not yet driving a cab at that point. That would start when I moved in with Stella. I still worked as a waiter at Williams Cafe, but the restaurant was slow one night and I was sent home early. My studio was on the ground floor of an old brownstone 6 blocks from Lake of the Isles. The key worked, but the door to my studio was chained from the inside. How could I have done that? How I could have done that, I thought in self-rebuke. It took a moment for not to have done that. Someone else did that. That someone was inside. I sprinted down the hall. I burst out of the front door and dashed to where I could see my apartment window. The alley light lit them in silhouette. One leg curled out the window of my studio, then his torso, then the other leg. He stumbled and almost fell before he ran. Then the other one rolled out with grace of a pole vaulter clearing the bar. His long hair flounced up and down in the low yellow light Like a fool, I chased them halfway down the alley. Like an even bigger fool, I called the cops. When they arrived, even with the Murphy bed closed into the wall, there was little space left, with one large cot by the sink and stove, and me and his partner in the middle of the room. You have this wad of cash on you, or you left it here when you went to work. The one by one sink said to me, pointing to the money in the dish drainer, tip money that I carelessly left by the sink until I went to the bank. I told him I had left it there. Did you leave this Miranda camera here when you went to the restaurant? I nodded. The cop by the sink was counting 88, 80, 85, 90, $95 in cash, a camera worth, two C notes, $300 worth of stuff just left here. You say two people climbed in, chained the door from the inside, and then what? Played bridge, had a cup of coffee. You see how it looks from where we stand? I have a right to privacy. That's what they stole. They looked at me as though I had said I have a right to shingles. My books had been taken from my bookshelf and arranged on the floor in neat, orderly rows. The case to my typewriter was open, and pages from a novel I was writing were spread on the desk. Whoever did this knew my schedule. They thought they had time. Time for what? You won't know that unless you investigate. The cop by the sink nodded. Investigate. Gotcha. Then he stopped and picked up two books from the floor. I. F. Stone, The Killing at Kent State, How Murder Went Unpunished, Karl Marx, The Communist Manifesto. He placed them back both neatly on the floor. What are you reading this stuff for? Not surprisingly, I soon moved in with Stella and Malika and a gun in the closet that we didn't know how to use. Mm. We had fallen back to sleep after making love when we heard someone enter Stella's apartment. We were naked under the sheets. It was 9:30 in the morning. For a moment, I thought, this isn't happening. Now I realized what struck such terror in me, that which I had no words for at the time. My mind flashed on the image of our throats being slit. This isn't a robbery. They want to be heard. They want us to know they're here. I jumped out of bed. My feet slapped the wood floor. I opened the closet where Stella kept the gun Jamal had given her. Stella wasn't alarmed. She told me it was Malika, who'd left earlier for school. She must have forgotten something. The front door and living room were near Stella's bedroom. As she tugged into her clothes, she called out through the door. What'd you forget, Malika? There was no answer. A chair scraped the floor. I started to get dressed as well, but Stella motioned for me to stay in the bedroom. Let me talk to her before you come out. The voice that accosted Stella in the living room did not belong to Malika. Aren't you tired of this pattern, Stella, putting in cold storage whenever you find something new? Aren't you tired of this pattern, Stella, putting me in cold storage whenever you find someone new? It was Josephine. I couldn't believe it. Oh, Josephine should be a new name for Karen. The liberal Karen. The liberal Karen, we'll call him Josephine now. It was Josephine. I couldn't believe it. After what Stella had told her just the other day about boundaries, this woman had the nerve to enter the apartment again without knocking. Get out, I heard Stella say. He's your daughter's age. I opened the bedroom door in time to see Stella grab Josephine and yank her toward the door. Hattie McDaniel is dead. You're not welcome anymore. They were on the front porch now. Josephine didn't fight back, but nor was she cowed. I stayed inside the screen door, not knowing what role was or should be, not knowing what my role was or should be. Stella told Josephine, "You've been misled. I'm not here for your amusement, and you being a nuclear physicist at the University of Minnesota doesn't make you Scarlett O'Hara." Stella, we used to be there for each other. Stella let out a shrill laugh. That's what you call it, there for each other? You're a parasite, no, a psychopath. You act like you own me. The word psychopath inflamed Josephine's face. For nearly 40 years, the expression on her face had boomeranged from the back of my brain at intervals beyond my control. I last saw it at the movies. The film was 12 Years a Slave, and a woman in the film by the name of Mary Epps looked first at her husband and then at her husband's concubine, a slave named Patsy, with the same wild eyes and thin mouth at Josephine's. In the film, Mary Epps demands that her husband sell Patsy, but Edwin Epps tells her that he divorced her before he sold Patsy. This all takes place in the drawing room at midnight. Edwin Epps has forced his family slave to wake up, even though they must work in the fields in a few hours, and play music and dance for him in the drawing room. What's telling about this scene is the way Patsy functions as an object, but not a object, for both Edwin and Mary. You will sell her, Mary demands. The slaves, having stopped dancing, they are all in the same room with the couple that owns them, but they are objects, not agents of the discussion, even Patsy. Neither Edwin nor Mary ever turn to Patsy and say, in the case of Edwin, for example, do you have to take on this mess? Or in the case of Mary, how could you be so low as to steal my husband? Patsy had enough survival skills to stay silent, but this doesn't stop Mary Epps from bashing her in the eye with a large crystal whiskey decanter when Edwin Epps refuses to sell her. I remember that part of 12 Years a Slave. That's a horrific scene. Shout out to Lupita Nyong'o. She dope actress. Did she win an Oscar for that? I think so. Anyway. For his part, Edwin simply sighs as Patsy, lying on her back on the floor, clutching her eye, is dragged away by two of the other slaves. He yells at them. He commands Solomon and the other fiddlers to go on playing. He shouts at the others to show some merriment and dance. He says, I will not have my mood spoiled. I don't think Josephine was enraged because she had just been called a psychopath. I think she was enraged because Stella had dared to speak. Josephine's slave had spoken, period. This has less to do with the actual word Stella used, psychopath, and more to do with the fact that an object meant merely for the pleasure of possession had gazed back at a human object. Stella had cracked out of turn. For years, Stella had suffered Josephine's presence and possessiveness diplomatically. In other words, Josephine had characterized Stella's behavior freely without restraint, but Stella had never returned the favor. It was the same pavane that black women have danced with white women for centuries, where only the white woman could break the rules and take hold of the black woman. Josephine was now furious. She ran through a list of names, 6 of Stella's past lovers, a famous saxophonist who got his start in Minneapolis and now had good work in Chicago, a Pro Bowl linebacker who had just been inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame, Noam Davidoff, the civil rights lawyer who had been in the news during Wounded Knee, her ex-husband, Yuri, whom Stella had helped make his mark as a counterculture photographer, a famous oil painter, and of course the man named Jamal, who couldn't decide, Josephine said, if he was a revolutionary or a heroin addict. Stella shoved her. Josephine didn't skip a beat as she stumbled down the stairs of the porch saying, now you're in there fucking a foster child. If I'm a psychopath, you're a pedophile. Oh shit, it's Bad Girls Club. This is a reality show. Liberal women acting bad. Liberal women acting bad. Oh, let's continue. So, Stella told Josephine that if she ever entered without knocking again, she, Stella, would treat it like a breaking and entering. People from the surrounding walk-ups took note of the two women standing on the gravel drive. Josephine raised her voice so that they could all hear and said, are you threatening me? First you assault me, now you're threatening me. The manager of the complex was outside tinkering on his 1976 Harley Davidson. I'd managed to avoid him up till now. His hair shagged down to his shoulders, but up front he was practically bald. He wore a black leather jacket with markings and insignia I didn't recognize, but he had friends with bikes and the same leather jacket with the same insignia that made my skin tremor when their engines rumbled down outside our windows. His name, I had learned, was Cody, and I often saw him in the company of bikers. He wore shades both day and night, and from his belt hung a leather sheath with a blade that was blacksmith from a railroad tie. Josephine and Cody had never been friends. Josephine once told Stella he looked like a rapist. And although Josephine and Cody were not that far apart in age, Josephine, with her close cropped hair, her oversized handbag, her wooden clogs, and her black tights and shapeless tunics, bore no resemblance to the women I had seen on the back of his motorcycle. But the bond they formed against Stella in the courtyard that day was formed spontaneously and with the ease of mental telepathy. Whiteness. They telecommunicated. All right, whiteness in code. White people stay on code. You attack one white person, or if a white person is on the defensive, all white people form the kitchen. I remember opening one of the drawers. The top drawer was for tableware. The middle drawer held soup ladles and kitchen knives. The bottom drawer held screwdrivers, hammers, and nails. I ran down the porch steps and over to Stella's side. She had just called them both xenophobes. All your $2 words, and you're still on welfare, Josephine said from behind her biker prints. Up until that moment, I had lived 23 years on this planet under the false assumption that my greatest fear was the fear of death. But now, as I saw the gothic patterns of death on Cody's jacket and the head of a rail spike that someone had forged into a knife, I knew that I was afraid of something much worse than death. A few folks from the other units ventured nearer now. They asked Cody and Josephine what was going on. It was then that it struck me, the thing I had never before been able to get hold of in words. I feared a death without meaning, a death without a story to it, a chain of events that would make sense to those who survived me, a clear and logical chain of events that anyone could read, and when they finished, lift their heads from the page and say, I can see why he died. It's under control, Cody told the people around us. Then to Stella, you need to go inside. You need to get out of Stella's face, I said. My palm was an oil slick. The hammer or knife I had grabbed in the kitchen kept slipping. I don't recall how this confrontation drew to a close. I can see all four of us exchanging words and then apparently walking away from each other. I can see Josephine walking away, and she's inviting Cody up to her apartment for a beer. She never said boo to him before. I see me and Stella mounting the steps of the porch. I see what came after because it didn't end there. What went down between Stella and Josephine can't be reduced to a fight between neighbors. The antagonism between them was figured before they even met. In other words, the die was cast hundreds of years ago on the plantation. The fact that Josephine was, on a conscious level, oblivious to this antagonism doesn't diminish it. In fact, when driven by the force of one's unconscious, one often plays out one's role with a deeper sense of commitment to maintaining the paradigm of despotic violence into which one has been stitched and stamped from the beginning. Stella, however, was a student of racial antagonisms. Her seeming obliviousness to the irreconcilability between her position in the world and Josephine's was not so much the labor of unconscious disavowal as, I would say, a tactical maneuver of the mind, one she'd designed for years in order to postpone, if not avoid altogether, the very moment at which she and Josephine had arrived, the moment in which the antagonism insisted upon a stage on which it could be played out in the open. Stella, in other words, has spent years attempting to displace her reservation and discomfort over Josephine's behavior as a white person onto Josephine's commitment to nuclear energy. She wanted to make the conflict sane by honing in on the contradiction between Josephine's liberal politics and her reactionary commitment to nuclear fusion. This is far more manageable for a black person's mind than nightly ruminations on the ways in which my upstairs neighbor is my master and I am her slave. There's no hope for a redemptive narrative if that is the case. But this was a function of Stella's active intellectual labors, a mind game she played with herself to crowd into corners distant and dark her acute awareness not just of the power imbalance between her and Josephine, but of the rituals of terror and the regime of violence that allowed white women to see in her face what they needed to see. You can live a lifetime as a white woman's mirror, Stella once told me. She was the implement of Josephine's renewal and sense of herself. What happens when a tool talks back when the mirror breaks itself? It seemed like 4 days didn't go by without Stella needing to claim her right to privacy. Each time Josephine seemed to harden, a chitlin shell now surrounding her, a chitin shell now surrounding her. When Stella called Josephine a xenophobe, Josephine looked like she'd been hit with a nasty gym shoe. There were 3 or 4 neighbors in the courtyard. They heard it too. They stopped. No one said anything. Josephine seemed to have lost the air of command she carried so effortlessly. I can't say that effortlessly. The whole ordeal lasted all of 30 seconds, but it seemed like a 3-year root canal. At last, Josephine said, I don't know what that word means. The scientists have been bested by the welfare mother. If only it was that and that alone. Josephine seemed to quake. She stood perfectly still. She didn't bat an eye, but everyone could see the crags. An earthquake of shame had torn through her pride. Stella made Josephine suffer, made her watch her mouth for the hint of a smile. Look it up, said Stella. On a plantation, Stella would have paid on the spot for her cheekiness and paid for it in flesh. Josephine would have had her horse whipped in the middle of the courtyard. But this was the winter of 1979, 1980, and it was Minnesota, not Mississippi. And Minnesota, after all, was the land of progressives. A public whipping would embarrass Josephine and her liberal sense of ethics. And yet, rather than avoid Stella and let us live in peace, Josephine did all she could to set the stage, to occasion, and allow the conditions that were guaranteed to lead to her humiliation. She was a masochist, yes, but she was also in charge of the masochistic encounter. Hattie McDaniel is dead, Stella had averred. She was saying she was sick and tired of being Josephine's tool, a stage prop, as she put it, for whatever sick shit is going on in your mind. These words index the regime of violence I alluded to earlier, a regime of violence that Josephine, as a white person, had at her disposal, whether or not she ever tapped into it. For decades, I had tried to understand why Josephine and later her two male accomplices, Cody and another man whom I had never seen before, took her satisfaction from our flesh, how it got to the point where our only options were to go upstairs and break her door down in an effort to find out why our skin was burning, or to flee our home, leave completely, drop a note in her mailbox. We give up. You win. You would not have been the first black family to be run out of town. In 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street was burned to the ground. 35 people were massacred. 800 were hospitalized. Black businesses were bombed from the air. And picnic lynching is not an oxymoron, but a blending of pleasures and psychic renewal. When Stella said Hattie McDaniel is dead, she named herself as Josephine's slave. In the South, perhaps, such a naming wouldn't work in Stella's favor. If Josephine had been a Southerner, she might have been immune to shame, and she might not have been Stella's friend. But Josephine didn't see herself as a Southerner. She saw herself as an enlightened Northerner. What true-blood woman from the land of cotton would wear clogs and REI jackets and choose to live a mile from campus in a ramshackle block of flats where students lived cheek by jowl with a few gray beard relics from the new left, middle-aged bohemians, and a few young sanctified yuppies living on the cheap, trying to save enough money to cross the river and move downtown. The courts, as our complex was called, did not seem like the antebellum South. Yet in some strange way, every single scene in America is played out on an antebellum stage. It's just that in the North, it can take the actors some time to learn the lines and play their roles. Josephine didn't know how she'd been cast. The roles she and Stella had played for so long were only legible in her unconscious, until Stella said, Hattie McDaniel is dead. The brilliance of recognition flashed in her eyes. The terror of lynchings, whippings, mutilations, and other people's violent consumption of the African continent unmasked itself as her birthright, an inheritance she did not have to ask for. The tension between Josephine and Stella, and later between Cody and me, escalated into violence. Violence that is hard to mold into narrative because violence is a narrative in a narrative must have an explanation, a trigger, a contingent moment that makes it make sense. But anti-black violence won't cooperate with narrative. The explanation bleeds out beyond the actors. It is immune to rational thinking and logical predictions. It is a force from which there is no sanctuary. It is rainproof to rebuke, for it comes as enforcement followed by the law. When violence is the law and not the effect of its enforcement, it presents the rules of narrative with a crisis, because what we have is a situation that resists retelling, for the simple reason that narrative's causal principle, the ghost in the machine we call the causal logic or because principle of the story, is missing. This is how a black story is jinxed. There is no ghost in the machine. The reason for the violence is beyond the grasp of reason. There's nothing universal about it. Therefore, the only way to make it intelligible is to leave out the parts that may only be accepted by another black person, and even then, discreetly. What if you belonged to a race of people with a private army under the command of their fantasies? Reason would have to go to war with your regime of violence before your conditions would be ripe for you to reconsider the phantasms you have projected onto the world. Imagine the resources of a violent structure that can deputize the whims of an entire race. Slave narratives have tried to imagine this violence, but they have also turned away at crucial moments, moments when it becomes clear that without a causal logic, the story will fall apart. In cases such as these, the solution has been to disavow the inconvenient truths and get on with narrative. This is how Northerners get along. We lived in the northernmost state on the Mississippi River. We're calling people by their names: Josephine, Stella, Frank, Cody, while at the same time disavowing their positions within a regime of violent master slave is required for the sake of racial harmony. But 1,000 miles south, as the crow flies, on that stretch of the Mississippi from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, the antagonisms have routinely been played out in the open. If one asked Mary Epps why she bashed Patsy's eye with a whiskey decanter, or why she goaded Edwin Epps into whipping Patsy within an inch of her life, as he eventually does, even she would try to find a reason. Patsy seduced my husband, which would fall apart the moment it was brought to her attention that Patsy lived without consent, without that without, that is, the right to accept or deny Edwin and Mary access to her body. As a slave, Patsy has no right to sanctuary, sexual or otherwise. Edwin Epps might also feel compelled to make sense of the senseless mutilation. I whipped Patsy at the end of the film because she betrayed me. I think she slept with Solomon and she left the plantation without my permission. He would not be consciously lying. But much like Josephine, who couldn't tap into the core of her relationship to Stella until Stella said, Hattie McDaniel is dead, Edwin Epps would have forgotten the key word he spoke whenever he brutalized his slave: pleasure. I am in my pleasure. Both Solomon Northup's autobiography and the film Steve McQueen made from it are queasy about the way society's pleasure is subtended by anti-Black violence. They hold it up to us, only to disavow its depth. Josephine, with her annual subscription to Miss Magazine, her small donations to the Sierra Club, her no-nonsense clogs, and her green Carter Mondale bumper sticker, a tested and trustworthy team, was the spectator the film had in mind when it felt the need to lie. But Josephine was also a modern-day doppelganger of Mary Epps and Edwin Epps combined. The film tries to anchor the whippings that a Black woman receives in the rational explanation of jealousy and transgression. In other words, the narrative asks us to believe that the principal reason for so much mutilation of the flesh is contingent upon some inappropriate act, a transgression that can't be named. We are told Mary Epps, the wife of a ruthless plantation owner, wants Patsy, a beautiful, of course only the beautiful ones are wanted, and reproductive slave, beaten and sold because her husband creeps down from the mansion at night to rape Patsy, an act he no doubt sees as more amorous than violence. We are told that Solomon's back is opened with a paddle and a whip because he could not be disciplined, or because he and other slaves did not pick his quota of cotton for that day. Jealousy and transgression put the audience at ease, release them from the horror of having to think of this violence as pleasure without purpose, like an act of love or a song in the heart of skipping, like an act of love or a song in the heart, or skipping down the street when no one is looking. All the things that sustain human life but don't appear on the ledger. What if anti-Black violence could be counted among the things that make life life without registering as profit or loss? What if jealousy and transgression are ruses, disguises that the real reasons for the violence hide behind? If no contingency triggers this violence, how can it fit into a story? How do we make sense of a pre-logical phenomenon like anti-Black violence? Now that nobody's here, I can finally talk about this in a part that relates to this. He is saying here that anti-Black violence, hatred of Blackness, by people that are non-Black or racialized as non-Black, however you want to think about it, is important for just life and life to exist. Now, oftentimes, I get, I get, I get, I get to the point where I want to beat my meat. All right, I be wanting to beat my meat sometimes, and I be going to, like, the sites. I be going to the hubs and the tubes and stuff like that, and the stuff that's floating out there right now since MAGA won. And I can say this now that nobody's listening and nobody's here, so we're going to keep it clear. The MAGA stuff that they're putting out in relation to like race play and IR and BBC and all that sort of stuff is sick. Now, I'm not that type of guy that only watches IR or race play. No, not at all. Not at all. But I saw a video that recently came out where the white folks are celebrating MAGA win by having a white woman play with the dildo. Okay, Acne says she's here. Okay, never mind. Never mind. I'm not gonna tell the story now. Not gonna tell the story now. All right, story's done. Anyway, just know white folks are celebrating the MAGA win by talking about aborting black babies, not talking about what MAGA will do for them. It's really just for the psychic benefits of torturing black people. All right, I'm just letting y'all know that. I'm letting y'all know that the stuff is out there for y'all to find. Okay, or if you're curious, but it's there. Okay. Anyway, continuing on in the story. So I am in my pleasure. In other words, the whippings are a life force, like a song or good sex without a procreative aim. Jouissance is the word that comes to mind, a French word that means enjoyment in terms both of rights and property, and of sexual orgasm. The latter has a meaning partially lacking in the English word enjoyment. Jouissance compels the subject to constantly attempt to transgress the prohibitions imposed on his or her enjoyment, or to go beyond the pleasure principle. Jouissance is an anchor tenet of psychoanalysis, but until the work of the critical theorists David Marriott, Jared Sexton, and Saeed Hartman, that is to say, prior to an Afro-pessimist hijacking of psychoanalysis, devotees of Lacan and Freud had not made the link between jouissance and the regime of violence known as social death. This juxtaposition, unfortunately, takes place at a level of abstraction that is too high for narrative and the logic of storytelling. Unlike violence against the working class, which secures an economic order, or violence against non-black women, which secures a patriarchal order, or violence against Native Americans, which secures a colonial order, the jouissance that constitutes the violence of anti-Blackness secures the order of life itself, sadism in service to the prolongation of life. Basically saying, like, people take so much joy out of beating on black people, it literally brings life and rejuvenates them, which is sick in a certain way, but it explains a lot of things. One thing that makes this sadism life affirming and communal, as opposed to destructive and individual, is the fact that it is a family affair. In his book, Solomon Northup recalls episodes of Patsy's beatings with details that are crucial and missing from the film. Mistress Mary Epps, he writes, stood on the piazza among her children, gazing on the scene with an air of heartless satisfaction. The scene that Solomon Northup paints of Mary Epps standing on the piazza brings to mind the musings of Mary Boykin Chestnut. Chestnut, yeah. The most cited chronicler of the American Civil War, who wrote, "Our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family exactly resembles the white children. All the time they think to themselves patterns, models of husbands and fathers. In the realm of the conscious mind, Mary Chestnut is as incensed by the licentious satisfaction white male slaveholders extract from black women as Mary Epps is in her conscious mind as well." But Solomon Northup's psychoanalytic labor indexes how, in the realm of the unconscious mind, this heartless satisfaction is the currency of men like Edwin Epp and their wives, despite the fact that only the former can secure his satisfaction in the open. The point to be made is that this satisfaction is shared, even if its expression is not. Like her husband, Mary Epps is in her pleasure, and she is also with her children, who are in their pleasure as well. This generalization of satisfaction and pleasure, subtended by gratuitous violence against black flesh, fans out from the conventional sadism between sexual partners to a family gathering of adults and children of all ages, like the Epps' son, a boy of 10 or 12 who rides his pony out to the cotton fields and without discrimination applies the rawhide, urging slaves forward with shouts and occasional profanity. We would be wrong to think that the boys urging slaves forward lends purpose and legibility to the violence. It does not. Like any other child, the boy is at play. He is in his pleasure. Each time he rides his little pony to the fields, he compels an old man named Uncle Abram to be his cheering squad, his chorus to laugh and commend him for being a thorough-going boy. Northup's book implies, without stating directly, why this generalization of sadism, brutality as the constituent element of family bonding, cannot be understood as being triggered by transgressions. It is as ubiquitous as the air he breathes. It was rarely a day passed without more whipping. It is the literal, unvarnished truth that the crack of the lash and the shrieking of slaves can be heard from dark till bedtime. Patsy and Solomon, unlike Stella and me, were living in a place and time when civil society and the human were neither ashamed nor embarrassed by this. 1,000 miles upriver and 126 years later, Josephine was shocked by this inheritance, but it didn't take her long to recover and to claim it. Though the structure of Stella's life, or better, the paradigm of social death for the quotation marks are essential here, cannot be reconciled with the structure of Josephine's life or the paradigm of social life. There is a connection, but this connection is parasitic and perverse, regardless of what the socially dead black person, i.e., Stella and Patsy, or the socially alive human, i.e., Josephine or Mary Epps, might say about their relationship. It is parasitic because white and non-black subjectivity cannot be imbued with the capacity for self-knowledge and intersubjective community without anti-black violence, without, that is, the violence of social death. In other words, white people and their junior partners need anti-black violence to know they're alive. Junior partners are people who are human but not white, here to males. For example, people of color and white women who are targets of white supremacy and patriarchy, respectively, and simultaneously the agents and beneficiaries of anti-blackness. This category also includes LGBT people who are not black and indigenous communities. They are partners because, as with white hetero males, anti-blackness is the genome of their paradigmatic position, and because they suffer at the hands of contingent violence rather than the gratuitous or naked violence of social death. Got it. If Hattie McDaniel were truly to die, as Stella proclaimed, it would be tantamount to the death of a parasite's host. This is what makes social death and something more surreal. This is what makes social death something more surreal than the end of breath. It is the words of David Marriott, a deathliness that saturates life, not an embalming, a resource for human renewal. It is perverse for many reasons, one of which is the fact that as civil society matures from 1853 to December 1979, when it all went south with Josephine, and we have historically, from the obvious technologies of chattel slavery to universal suffrage, the discourse of human rights and the concept of universal access to civil society, the anti-black violence necessary for the elaboration and maintenance of white and non-black subjectivity gets repressed and becomes increasingly unavailable to conscious, as opposed to unconscious speech. I judge people by the quality of their character, as Dr. King said, and not by the color of their skin, or the commonly spoken, at the end of the day, we're all Americans and we're in this together, and other such malarkey of the conscious mind. But the pageantries of naked and submissive black flesh, pageantries of bleeding backs and buttocks, whip marks, amputations, and faces closed by horse bits provide evidence of the role sadism plays in the constitution of white subjectivity. And 12 Years a Slave makes this visible on the screen, despite its repression in the narrative of both the film and civil society writ large. It is tempting and commonplace to reduce Mary and Edwin Epps' sadism to individual psychopathology, or one might think that Edwin Epps is one of a group of exceptionally sadistic people who lived in an exceptionally sadistic time and place. But the film, and to an even greater extent the autobiography, sees rather than narrates sadism, the sexual perversion in which gratification is obtained by inflicting physical or mental pain on a loved object, not as the individual pathology of a handful of people, but as a generalized condition, generalized in that pleasure as a constituent element of communal life cannot be disentangled from anti-black violence. Conventionally, the object of sadism can tomorrow become the subject of sadism, but the sadism that constitutes the spectacles of 12 Years a Slave, and which constitutes early 19th century society, is not imbued with such reciprocity. The slaves of social death cannot switch places and make Edwin Epps or his equally cruel wife the love objects of their collective sadism. If they did so in private, if Patsy beat Edwin or Mary in a private bedroom encounter, for example, it is because such a reversal was occasioned and allowed. In other words, the master used his prerogative and power to play a different game, one in which he suffers because suffering fulfills his fantasy, and because, unlike the slave, his fantasies have objective value. Such role reversals do not imbue the encounter with reciprocity. The changes that begin to occur after the Civil War end up through the civil end and up through the civil rights movement, Black Power, and the American election of the Black president are merely changes in the weather. Despite the fact that the sadism is no longer played out in the open as it was in 1840, nothing essential has changed. Very interesting. Very interesting right here. Let's see. All right. Day one. What is this? What is this? I'm just checking where we are in this chapter. All right. So chapter 3 is hella long. Chapter 3 is hella long, and I'm a bit tired. I'm actually gonna wrap this up right here. Yeah, I don't know what's happening right here. We're probably gonna wrap up chapter 3 because this is a whole lot right here. Chapter 3 is quite extensive, but I find this book endlessly fascinating, very relatable, very deep, very funny at times, very sad at other times. And I'm very glad that I'm finally getting to read this. So we'll probably stop here on, yeah, that's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 3 is very long. So it runs up to page 146, and we're like on page 115 now or something like that. So we're going to pick up here. We won't finish chapter 3, though we read quite a lot of chapter 3. So, all right, hold on. All right, hold on. Where were we? Let's wrap it up here. I want to be able to pick up from here next time we meet. All right. Nothing essential had changed. So we're in part 5. Okay. So we'll wrap this up here. We've been reading for like a good 2 hours or so. Got a good reading. Very, very fascinating book. Love this book. And really would like to know what people thought about Afro-Pessimism as a framework. Let's see if I have charge on my computer. I don't have charge here. My computer's dead. Let's see if it's on the screen here. Useful framework. Let's see. What did y'all say? I think it's tied 50-50. End the poll. Oh, come on. Hold on. I'm trying to end this poll right here to get the results. Let's see. So only 2 votes. Afro-Pessimism as a useful framework. It's a faulty framework, and it's the default framework to have 0%. I know that's mostly trolls, people who didn't take this seriously at all. But really enjoying this book. Hope you enjoy it too. Pick it up for yourself. Go buy it. Go buy it. Go buy this book. And we'll finish chapter 3 in our next live reading because chapter 3 is about 50 or so pages. And looking forward to conquering this text. And y'all be easy out there. Don't be pessimistic. Just be Afro-pessimistic. Peace.